This public hearing of the Foreign Affairs and Aid Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade for the inquiry into the role of Australia's International Development Program on preventing conflict. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which each of us is calling from today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, but also acknowledge the cultures of any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present with us today. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the committee's webpage. I now welcome representatives from the Development Intelligence Lab to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Bridie Rice, CEO of the Development Intelligence Lab.
Martina Zapf, General Manager of the Development Intelligence Lab.
And William Leben, Strategic Advisor, Development Intelligence Lab.
Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding at the Parliament, and the giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I would now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions. To assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before making your opening statement and when responding to each question.
Bridie Rice. Thank you, Chair. Some of Australia's neighbours know all too well what it looks like when conflict breaks out. The 2003 Solomon Islands tensions are a really obvious example. Violence escalated gradually before boiling over, becoming beyond the capacity of that state to cope. Now, we all often call that low-level conflict. Around 200 people were killed, up to 35,000 were displaced, and progress for ordinary Solomon Islanders was set back by years, if not decades. But for Australia, the consequences were also significant. The regional assistance mission to Solomon Islands, what we call Ramsay, it ran for 14 years at a cost of at least $2.6 billion, half the annual aid program, and many estimate much more. But what is striking is that the drivers of those tensions in Solomon Islands were not unknown. They were land tensions, they were youth unemployment, they were frustration with weak governance, distrust in institutions, they were slow-moving pressures, the kinds of pressures that sit squarely within development, governance and social policy domains, not the sorts of pressures or problems that could have been solved by police or military cooperation alone. And many of those pressures remain today in Solomon Islands and across many countries in the Indo-Pacific. But what has changed is the context. In 2026, these local pressures are increasingly interacting with geostrategic rivalry. And that makes those pressures sometimes more volatile, more dangerous. And they're pressures that are occurring at a time where Australia's defence and police forces are often already strained. I arrived back in Canberra yesterday from Nepal. Last September, protests in Kathmandu ignited that city for a week. Lives were lost and politicians were forced to flee from their homes. And across every context where the three of us have worked, this pattern coming into internal conflict, it's consistent. Pressures start building, often at a household level. People demand more from their politicians, their government institutions, and those institutions sometimes fail to respond. Then a trigger occurs, and either that trigger creates the new foundations of peace and that community navigates its tensions well, or the crisis escalates. And only when that crisis escalates, then do security responses step in to respond. And if we wait for that final crisis stage, that security response, then we are already too late to have prevented a conflict. So Australia having a deliberate conflict prevention approach is about Australia acting earlier in that cycle, more deliberately, more specifically. acting when those risks are still manageable and the costs are still low. Now, when your committee's inquiry began, conflict was already rising globally, as well as risks of conflict in our region starting to surface. And just months later, we find ourselves in a different world again. Internal conflicts are no longer a once-in-a-quarter-century disruption to Australian foreign affairs. Conflict is becoming a new norm. And if it caught us by surprise during the days of Ramsey or even in the days of Timor-Leste in 1999, then we worry that it might catch us by surprise again. And for Australia, sadly, we believe that conflict prevention must now become a central function of both Australian foreign policy as well as our development cooperation. But the question is how? So now your committee has heard expert evidence from practitioners, from peace builders, academic, government institutions. But the Development Intelligence Lab, we're a Canberra-based policy-oriented think tank. We operate as a constructive and contestable policy partner to government, where Australia does engage in lower and middle income countries. And so when we think about the challenge ahead for government, we think that there are really 6 practical questions for government to solve, and that's set out in our supplementary submission. We also propose 6 priorities that government can adopt to address them. So just briefly, the first question is one of strategy. What is Australia's approach to conflict prevention? Now, we propose a whole of government conflict prevention model, not a big white paper, a simple statement. What is conflict prevention? Who does what? And where does it matter most? The second question to solve is a parliamentary question. Who is ultimately responsible? We propose ministerial and parliamentary oversight mechanisms, including an annual statement to Parliament, reporting on shifts and changes in conflict risks to Parliament, and in-camera briefings for those sensitive discussions that we know need to happen. Third is a bureaucratic question. Who coordinates conflict prevention? And we propose a central unit to prioritise and to integrate that action. When something is everyone's responsibility, it risks being no one's. We've learnt this on climate change. We've learnt it on gender equality. We've learnt it on geostrategically driven intrastate conflict. Why not on internal conflict as well? Fourth is the resourcing question. How can we pay for it? We propose a targeted peace and resilience fund, modest, perhaps NPP funding to begin or pooled funds, but sadly we haven't seen a situation where a nation has been able to shift their approach on conflict prevention without resourcing it with both the dollars as well as the energy and the people to do it. Fifth is a practical question. How would it work? And we propose to have 4 country pilots, so not a wholesale overhaul of everything that Australia does, but doing a little bit, doing it well, doing it where it matters most. And sixth is the question of evidence. How will Australia monitor and know when to act on conflict? And on that, we propose the establishment of a resilience monitoring system. Early warning conflict monitoring systems regularly pick up signals too late, but a system monitoring conflict risks and sources of resilience in a nation would enable us to act earlier, more deliberately in adjusting our approach. So our central message is simple. If Australia is serious about conflict prevention, if we recognise the increased risks of conflict in the region, then continuing our approach with the status quo doesn't seem like a viable option. So our proposal is a practical, operational system to make conflict prevention real where it matters most. A document setting out the approach, someone in Parliament and someone in the bureaucracy responsible, MPP or pooled funds to get it going in 4 pilot countries with some high quality analysis underpinning it in a resilience monitoring system. So thank you so much for having us here today and for the work of your committee, and I really look forward to our discussion.
Thank you for that opening statement and your 2 submissions to this inquiry. Before we go to questions, I'll just allow members of the committee who are joining us here to introduce themselves. I'll start in the room in Canberra and then we'll go around the virtual attendees.
In South Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Zapier. Deputy Chair.
Hi everyone, Leon Rebello, Federal Member for McPherson on the Gold Coast, and I'm the Deputy Chair as well.
Thank you. Other virtual members attending?
Madonna Jarrett, Federal Member for Brisbane.
Dean Smith, Liberal Senator for Western Australia.
David Batt, Federal Member for Hinkler in Regional Queensland.
Thank you, colleagues. I'll exercise my prerogative as a chair and kick off with a few questions. Can I drill down into this question of articulating an explicit approach to conflict prevention? Your submission makes clear that conflict prevention has become a clear foreign policy priority for the government, but that there's no established articulation of either our foreign conflict prevention approach or a preventative architecture. Your submission says that, quote, the central issue is not necessarily the absence of conflict prevention activity, but the absence of a defined, practical, active and operationalised system to ensure consistent and high impact conflict prevention through all elements of statecraft, including the development program. Can I ask, what are the signs that you can see that the effectiveness of Australia's conflict prevention activities are being undermined by a lack of coordination, and where should we as parliamentarians be looking to see if this issue is manifesting?
Thank you, Chair. One of the concerns that we have is that as an outside agency, it's very, very difficult to see what is happening on the inside. So I say this with a level of respect and humility about all the internal machinations of government. But certainly in our experience, the sorts of signs that we would be seeing if Australia did have a high-performing conflict prevention approach would be simple things, like there would be a recognition of subnational or internal conflict drivers being absolutely critical alongside a lot of the dominant conversation around big sea conflict, be it in the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, Middle East and elsewhere. We don't always see evidence of those conversations happening. Other things that we would see signals of would be in the procurement pipelines. Agencies would be putting out program proposals where designs for multi-million-dollar programs would have conflict sensitivity analyses in them, where directions would be given to police forces or defence cooperation to be making sure that their operations don't, for example, unintentionally drive conflict where we're looking to mitigate it. We would be operating in a situation where, as a think tank, it would be regular, easy and effortless to be convening conversations on conflict prevention. We would have single points of call, for example. You would see a level of consensus about which countries Australia operates in that are most prone to conflict. And I would imagine that you would have your intelligence agencies and other monitoring fora, for example, focusing on subnational drivers of conflict alongside geostrategic as well. So I think they're probably some of the signs that we would see if there was an agreed definition of what conflict prevention did and didn't include, and a specific definition, not just that all development cooperation helps to reduce risks of conflict, but specifically identifying country by country what those drivers of conflict are. And then you should be able to see budget and effort allocations deliberately attuned to those risks of conflict. Now, at this point in time, it's natural that it's hard to see that entirely on the outside. We wouldn't expect to see explicit articulation of that in things like development partnership plans as such. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that without a central approach and strategy, we're missing a conversational level of action around conflict prevention. Ambassadors, for example, I'm not convinced that there is pre-induction conflict sensitivity training before you deploy into a place like Timor, Papua New Guinea or elsewhere. So there's some of the signs that I'd be looking at, but my colleagues, William and Martina, may like to add something to that.
I can provide a few examples as well to give a bit more color. This is Martina Zapp speaking. the kinds of things that we would see, and again, with the caveats that Bridie already set out, we know that some of these issues are very sensitive. We obviously have diplomats here in the driver's seat navigating those negotiations with partner countries who are very skilled at raising those things with the right terms. We might not broach partnership conversations as conflict prevention, but we can talk about social cohesion, we can talk about resilience, we can talk about how trust can be strengthened, and how local dispute resolution mechanisms, for example, can be harnessed. Now, quite concretely, together with some experts, we looked at what we can see at the moment in the development program. And again, we do not see everything that is happening in classified spaces. But as an example, one of our peace building experts analyzed the Solomon Islands development program. And while that has a lot of strong signals that account for the post-conflict environment that country is in, what we're, for example, not seeing is much engagement on the role of traditional governance structures in churches that are absolutely crucial in sustaining social cohesion. We're seeing quite a lot of focus on sort of central government, but not as much on the everyday conflict and social cohesion risks that people are experiencing across other regions of the country. Also, with other experts that we've worked with who are deeply engaged in Papua New Guinea, we can see that the development program is very focused on economic development, infrastructure, governance, which obviously aligns with PNG's national priorities, and that's very important. But what we're not seeing is as much focus on addressing some of the root causes of past conflict and potential future conflict, such as inequality, land disputes, the erosion of traditional dispute resolution mechanisms. And we actually think there's a lot of potential in some of Australia's programs, like the Law and Justice Partnership, to strengthen that. So to not only focus on the formal institutions, but to also integrate more community level peace building work. Thank you.
Can I suppose, get a little bit to where the rubber hits the road on these coordination mechanisms, and this is the resolution of different perspectives of disputes. Supplementary submission says that, quote, there are different understandings in government and the development community of what type of conflict matters most to Australia, how conflict can be prevented, and who does what. Can you articulate some of those different understandings and the way that better coordination inside government, better mechanisms for explicitly articulating an approach to conflict prevention could deal with those different understandings?
I might take that one. William Lehman, thanks, Chair, and thanks from my perspective as well for the committee for having us. So in our work, we've framed the issue along 3 pillars, which is very much congruent with other submissions and other evidence you've heard in this forum as well. Diplomacy, development and defence, working really with the grain of existing efforts in Australian kind of foreign and security policy. And that's probably a useful way to approach where the tensions and different understandings might lie. So from a defence point of view, unambiguously, the NDS and the national defence approach are squarely oriented on deterrence, deterrence by denial. I would argue, and I don't think this is particularly controversial, or that there may be other perspectives out there, that the diplomatic track is largely focused on what the Foreign Minister has repeatedly described as the preventative architecture in a diplomatic sense. So engagement with our partners in regional multilateral fora like ASEAN, and ASEAN in particular has been a big focus, but also bilateral efforts around mediation, discussion, reinforcement of norms and so on. And then the development track is more naturally focused at this local and subnational level, addressing subnational long-term drivers of resilience, economic and social development. Now, what we have described in that space is implicit mainstreaming, and that goes to remarks that Bridie and Martina have already made, where we recognise that there already is significant programming that spans efforts that may be focused primarily in other ways, like education or health programming, that do have conflict prevention relevance through to work which the Australian government has funded through ODA mechanisms that is explicitly and principally conflict prevention related. So work in Mindanao and the Philippines, for instance, some programming in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, long-standing efforts in Bougainville and so on. So we recognise that is happening, but that is focused very much at that subnational level. Now, we would argue that there are tensions between those different levers and that's natural. There always will be those tensions, but without a shared definition, and I think the evidence presented before the committee thus far would seem to indicate to us what we've read of the situation based on public information, that there isn't an explicit definition shared across agencies, and therefore those trade-offs are arguably ad hoc. They rely on leadership in different contexts, both in a Canberra sense and a post sense, and that presents a situation where obviously there is the potential for things to fall through the cracks. Different trade-offs are made on a different basis. It's very difficult to actually evaluate the status quo or for government in a coherent way to make those trade-offs in a way that prioritises the right tool for the right risk, and also recognises where things might be going astray.
On that question of things falling through the cracks, I'm interested in, I mean, we've heard significant evidence from DFAT, from Defence, from AFP that there is extensive coordination going on within the conflict prevention branch or within IDCs. I mean, I think DFAT said that there wouldn't be a day that goes by that they don't talk to colleagues in the Department of Defence. So there's lots of engagement going on, but as you say, in the absence of that explicit framework, that explicit agreement of what this conflict prevention task is. So can I ask that, are you able to give the committee some concrete examples of what falls through the cracks when this coordination doesn't occur within the context of a formally articulated conflict prevention framework, a common definition of conflict prevention? You know, what kinds of decisions don't get made without that explicit framework, or what kind of decisions only get made too late?
Typically in situations like this, the sorts of decisions that are harder to be made, and let me be clear, there are some very good conflict prevention decisions made, engagement and coordination, certainly in the past decade that I've spent in think tank land in Canberra, is better now than I have seen it previously. Just with that due regard given, I think the sorts of typical decisions that you see falling through the cracks, particularly on the development program, might be in areas like, for example, formal police cooperation or defence cooperation or law and justice, as Martina mentioned. If you have an explicit conflict prevention and risk assessment, then you might, in a place like Papua New Guinea, recognise that your police force is not just critical to the security of that nation, but can also be perpetrators of violence. You might recognise that the vast majority of Papua New Guineans, for example, don't seek recourse for justice through the formal justice system, but they do through informal justice systems as well. If you are linking that level of analysis or understanding the drivers of conflict in a country to actual action, then what you would see, for example, is in your development program, you would see more addressing of the drivers of conflict. In a place like Papua New Guinea, one of the most critical drivers of fragility in that nation is corruption. You might see a lot more work being done by Australian government agencies in that anti-corruption space, would be one example. The other thing that you would see is in the analytical rubrics. Naturally, as William described, where you have this hierarchy of different definitions of conflict prevention. If conflict prevention in your mind is about denial of adversaries in the Pacific, then naturally your analysis around that will be geared towards looking at foreign interference in a nation like Papua New Guinea or other places. If you were doing conflict sensitivity analysis, so you might actually see that one of the biggest drivers of potential violence and conflict in places like Papua New Guinea might be inequality. You'd be looking at youth demographics. You'd be looking at other issues of corruption, kleptocracy, and everything in between. Fundamentally, what slips through the cracks is a missed opportunity to have a development program geared towards long-term resilience, and instead having it geared towards whatever the dominant version of conflict prevention is in that country, be it geostrategic denial. And what we know is that many development programs, whilst they can generate great soft power dividends, relationships, they build trust, they are best geared, and they are one of the only arms of statecraft that is geared to deal with long-term resilience issues, health, education, aspects of fragility. So I think what would slip through the cracks in the absence of essential coordinating mechanism is everything from generating that understanding between our agencies on what are the drivers of conflict in an area, understanding where they come from, but most importantly, from our perspective, actually gearing your arms of statecraft to act coherently in a way that reduces those risks and not unintentionally increasing them in the process.
Your submission flags a number of institutional reforms and accountability mechanisms to, I guess, force ownership of this issue, both in inside government and in the Parliament. It did strike me just listening to your remarks earlier, though, where you were talking about when everyone's responsible, no one's responsible, and we've learnt this in the gender context, we've learnt this in the climate context. You know, for gender, for climate, we have dedicated ambassadorial roles for those issues to coordinate action, to raise the profile of the issue, to engage with Australia overseas. Similarly, I can think we have dedicated counter-terrorism ambassador roles for similar functions. Could a dedicated ambassadorial role on conflict prevention add to this accountability, add to the coalescing of expertise within the system on this issue? Is that something that you've considered amongst the institutional reforms that you've included in your submission?
Thank you, Chair. This is Martina Zapp speaking. Yes, we have indeed considered that option, and we think it can potentially add a lot of value. Actually, just in the last few weeks, we have engaged with the Ambassador for Cyber Affairs, and also I had the chance to engage with the Ambassador for Gender Equality just this week. And I've seen the powerful impact that those roles can have in elevating those thematic conversations across different elements of statecraft, across different areas within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So we certainly think that that's a valuable option if such an ambassadorial role is created. We think the key is that it's elevated, that is a Bench 2 ambassadorial role that has the stature and the power and the leverage to drive the issue, and that it's someone with expertise in the subject area. We've seen where thematic ambassadors really make a difference to their agendas. It's when those two conditions seem to be in place. And we think then it's really important also, if such a mandate is created, that it spans geostrategic and conflict risks within states. So that's the big divide and the big shift we really see is necessary. The current conflict prevention branch focuses on geostrategic risk, as they have stated before the committee themselves a few weeks ago. We really think we're in a context where geostrategic risk and fragility risks are so intertwined that whatever the coordinating function is at bureaucratic level or ambassadorial level needs to look across to really facilitate that coordination holistically at all kinds of conflict risks the region is facing. I just looked at World Bank data yesterday, and in fact, World Bank currently categorizes globally 17 states as fragile. 7 of those are in the Pacific. It's a really disproportionate amount. So those risks are very real in the region. And we need to pay attention to them just on par with the geostrategic risks.
If an ambassador, Bridie here, if an ambassador was to be appointed, though, I think that we would still be recommending other elements in our submission, particularly a conflict-related typology report and visibility coming up into Parliament, either into this committee or a broader committee that can take classified briefings as well. There have obviously been instances where an ambassadorial appointment without appropriate stature, power, resources and or visibility could risk paying lip service to an issue, which we think may unintentionally perpetuate some of the challenges we have on conflict prevention now. So an ambassador alone without those elements we don't think would work, but with the right conditions, then it could be a very, very effective recommendation.
I'll just ask one more question before giving the call to colleagues. On that issue of elevating the profile issue in the Parliament, you know, in your submission, you recommend the potential for in-camera briefings to key parliamentary committees, including potentially this committee or the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Defence, to support Parliament to be equipped with the information and analysis to assess if the political priority they place on conflict prevention is effectively executed in practice. You know, recommendations like this always attract the attention of parliamentary committees. But can I ask how you think about the trade-offs between explicit articulation of risks of conflict and the potential relationship impacts between the Australian government, Australian actors and actors in these fragile states that come from in-public discussion of these issues?
William Lieben, thanks, Chair. Clearly there is a trade-off, is the first thing to say, and we wouldn't want to be in a position of like denying that there are diplomatic sensitivities here and indeed sovereignty sensitivities. I think we would approach this from kind of at least two perspectives. One is that there is absolutely a viable balance to be struck in terms of information which is genuinely sensitive and must be dealt with behind closed doors, and the serious value of analysis in the open source, which trades in facts which are in very little dispute, and think that government's capable of having that conversation. Secondly, in terms of the management of the programming, what this would look like with partners. In evidence a few weeks ago, I think DFAT really usefully and frankly pointed out to your committee that one of the ways that the development partnership plans have been used with partners is to have what they described as honest conversations. Our diplomats are very good at what they do. So on the inside and the policy track of this, alongside whatever the public artefacts look like, while we absolutely support locally led approaches and they're appropriate, not just unto themselves, but particularly in this issue, where locally led analysis, locally led programming is a key part of the solution set. Our diplomats are capable of having these difficult conversations potentially on issues that are sensitive with partners on the confidential government side, alongside whatever the public face looks like. Bridie, I feel like you had something to add.
Bridie, just one additional point. We think that the value of having parliamentary oversight is not just the elevation of the issue, but the ability to direct and bring a level of coherence and to have political agency in these trade-offs. So what we know about conflict prevention when it impacts so many different realms of our foreign affairs is that ultimately choices will need to be made about whether or not Australia is prepared to tackle some of the tough drivers like issues of corruption or inequality, or to reorientate and make big decisions about Australia pulling money out of one area and putting it into another area. The value of a committee doing what you are doing right now in this inquiry is bringing these issues to the surface. And the idea that you can more consistently have oversight of where conflict risks are shifting and changing and where Australia needs to make those trade-offs, both diplomatically and developmentally, we think has got a very, very significant value and is very hard to do. As a former bureaucrat, it's very hard to do in a department alone without a moment on an annual basis to lift your head above the parapet and say, what are we actually seeing here? Because our experts, we know experts globally tend to gravitate towards seeing things as status quo, tend to naturally be concerned about resource constraints, ambition constraints, but quite often we find sometimes bureaucracies also feel more constrained by their political leaders as well. So a chance for political leaders to help make those decisions and trade-offs, we think, will unlock the ability for Australia's conflict prevention approach to improve.
Thank you. I'll give the call to Mr. Batt.
Thanks, Chair. In your submission, one of the recommendations that you mentioned already again and written in is about your Central Conflict Prevention Authority you think could work. And we've heard from DFAT earlier through our public hearings that they already have established a conflict prevention and strategy branch. So we just sort of are you aware of that? And do you think that is what you're looking at, or is it something else different to that to help with the fragmentation?
Thank you, Mr. Batt, for the question. Martina speaking. Yes, indeed, that branch exists and we work with them quite closely. What is very clear, and they have stated this themselves on the record, is that their mandate is squarely focused on interstate conflict risks. So they're looking at your geostrategic risks, they're looking at your conflict risks between states in the South China Sea and in other places. They are very much aware of how these risks are deeply connected with fragilities inside states. So when you have politics that are very elite driven, you don't have good trust in institutions, etc., it is much easier for geostrategic influencing to take place in this more fragile contexts. The mandate of the conflict prevention branch that exists does not cover those fragility risks. So they are only looking at a part of the equation, and we think that's where the role of that branch can really be strengthened if its mandate were to be expanded to look at the whole spectrum of conflict risks. We do think that that branch is probably quite uniquely positioned to play this role, also because we think the central node needs to sit somewhere where it can straddle security, diplomacy, and development domains. And where this branch sits, it is connected to the security apparatus. It obviously is deeply connected to diplomacy, and it can reach into the development space as well. So we think if that mandate is slightly adapted, obviously it needs to come with resourcing, it can be even more effective and can play this coordination function.
Thanks. So yeah, happy with the department doing this, just needs to be tweaked into a different role for what you're looking at.
Yes.
We think so. The only other possible opportunity to be explored would be a coordination function, for example, out of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. But ultimately, it feels at this point in time, given the limitations, that DFAT would be the right place.
No worries. Thanks, Chair. I'll let others have a question.
Thank you. Mr. Zapier.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for the submission to the inquiry. My question goes to you, the examples you provide where you say that Germany, Japan and UK as examples have a good conflict prevention policies within their relationship with the countries. Can you give me an example of where that conflict prevention strategy from those countries, or any one of them, has made a difference? I just want to get my head around what sort of things they might have done that you believe were effective.
Martina speaking. I can offer some comments on that. Thank you for the question, Deputy Chair. The mechanisms that we had in mind, for example, from the UK, is what it has evolved since, but it existed as what was called CSSF, Conflict, Security and Stabilization Fund. The interesting aspect of this fund was not only the funding mechanism, so it made available resources to act on conflict risks. What was interesting about it was that it brought together precisely what we're talking about, development, diplomacy, and security agencies to diagnose risks together, to analyze risks together, to make those trade-offs, and to choose interventions and mechanisms that can work in sync to address security risks, but also the underlying drivers of conflict risks, which the development program is uniquely placed to address, such as inequality, social cohesion, trust in institutions, and those kinds of issues. Germany has a stabilization platform, which is another mechanism, again, that is funding oriented, but also that plays an analytical role to analyze where risks are building and how responses are doing in responding to those, what's working, what's not, what are we learning, what do we need to adapt. I think one of the best examples internationally, it's very hard to prove prevention, right? Because you can't prove something that hasn't happened. It's the same in public health, it's the same with disaster risk prevention. So we face the challenge, what can we prove? Because we can't prove what hasn't happened. But what we can look at is, we know what types of issues drive conflict. It's inequality, it's lack of trust in institutions, it's social cohesion, it's grievances building around exclusion and those things. And we can look at, do interventions address those issues and build resilience? One of the prime examples internationally is actually from Africa. It's from Kenya, where you had significant election violence in 2007, 2008. You had around 1,000 people die. You had hundreds of thousands replaced as a result of that. So the fear was that the next election in 2013 could be marred in similar electoral violence. So in that intervening period between 2007-8 and 2013, and I was working with peace builders in Kenya at the time, there was a concerted effort by government, international partners, local peace builders, civil society, to address the underlying causes of that electoral violence. And while no one could be sure that 2013 would not be a repeat of 2007-8, those elections proceeded without violence. And so it is fair to assume, and research demonstrates, that with everything that was undertaking, that lowered the risk of that electoral violence recurring, and the election proceeded peacefully.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Tim.
Ms. Jarrett.
Sorry, everyone, some technological slowness on my end. I just wanted to pick up on some of your comments and wondering whether or not there are any examples of activities within the Australian context that actually are working well to address the, some of the fragility issues that you're talking about that suggest that we're not there yet. But are there any that are working well, or are there programs that could simply be just tweaked to get to addressing the issues you're raising?
Thank you, Ms. Jarrett. Bridie Rice speaking. I think there is a couple of areas of assistance that don't receive big glossy attention, but which are quite effective. So, for example, Australia has quite a sophisticated capability supporting countries in the Mekong, and I understand some places in the Pacific as well, around transnational organised crime. Now, organised crime can be a significant driver not only of inequality and stability, but also it erodes a lot of trust in government. There's some very quiet, effective institutional linkage type work that Australia does around supporting other countries, for example, with their anti-money laundering systems. Some work that I've done in a past life as an Australian government official. So I think that there are some very, very strong examples of where Australia can leverage its expertise and work quietly and effectively without grandstanding out there calling it conflict prevention, but certainly addressing some of the core drivers. And I think you see a lot of examples of that. You also see some explicit peace-related support and programming in places like Mindanao. It's very well regarded, Australia's support there, and depending on your opinion, in places like Bougainville as well. So absolutely there are examples. What we would say, though, is that these examples are not necessarily deliberate, and therefore they can tend to be tenuous. We've seen over the last decade very, very strong peace building or conflict prevention related programs just accidentally shift or change as government officials shift or change. And so what we would be saying is that sometimes these programs in Australian terms are a happy accident, or they're a positive deviance from the norm. And that if we were to have a central position around what conflict prevention was, and particularly in 4 countries where this matters the most, a really clear articulation of what those risks of conflict are, then I think what you would see is, instead of these pockets of good practice and happy accidents, you'd see a more deliberate effort like what Martina is describing. It requires over the course of 5 and 10 years in between elections to really actually address those root causes of conflict. I think, just to finish on, I think you would also possibly see Australia relook at 2 sectors in particular. I think you'd see us looking at our law and justice and security sector support. A lot of other donors have a history of thinking about security sector support as not just police cooperation or defence cooperation, but, for example, focusing on the trust between police forces and communities, defence forces and communities. So you'd see a bit of a shift there, perhaps more work being done around illegal weapons trades through Melanesia and elsewhere. And I think you would also see, if Australia was taking a more deliberate approach to conflict prevention, you'd see a lot more work in Australian development tackling AI misinformation and disinformation as well. This is a unique feature of Australian development. We are one of the only donors without a specific digital strategy. And at this point in time, as AI takes root as a real disruptor to development, we think that that's another area where you'd see tweaks. I hope that's helpful.
That is, can I just ask one other quick question? In relation to gender equality, because I'm hearing from on other inquiries that we're having, the role of women in resilience. Do you see there being a big overlap between what you're trying to achieve and linking in with the activities there? And I guess that would mean linking, if you had this new ambassador, linking in with the ambassador, your ambassador for our ambassador for women gender equality.
100%, and we certainly defer. I understand the committee has heard some great evidence given by the Humanitarian Advisory Group on gender equality the other day. But you're absolutely right. Clearly, one of the biggest predictors of peace in a nation is gender equality. I know that this committee would be well aware of that, but it is of significant concern, the gender equality rates that we're watching in the Pacific. And I simply don't think you could be doing conflict prevention work without that being a key focus for sure. And most importantly, not just in the development program, but through our diplomacy as well. And most importantly, when it comes to security, not just being reduced to a women, peace and security agenda, but actually being at the forefront of everything we do in defence cooperation, intelligence cooperation, transnational crime cooperation, development. So I couldn't be more supportive of those statements.
Thank you.
We're out of time at the moment, but Senator Smith just has one last question, so I'll just give him the call now.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for your contribution this morning. In your opening remarks, you talked about how some conflict scenarios don't come as a surprise. The preconditions to those, perhaps in hindsight, are well known. Can you identify any emerging conflicts or points of concern that Australia should have on its radar at the moment, but perhaps are not on the radar?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, no, do you want to go, Roddy or Martina? Sure, I'll start. Thanks, Senator William Leben. Look, I don't think I'm going to give you any amazingly revelatory answers or surprises here, unfortunately. I'll give the answer in 2 parts, which is where a smattering of the places that we think we should be oriented, and then kind of the question of surprises. Clearly, nobody will be surprised, inside or outside our government, to hear that we think, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Philippines in Southeast Asia, are the kind of places where we should be prioritising. Now, government should make a decision about those priorities with all the information it has on hand, not just in the public domain, as well as kind of where Australia has leverage. But these are the slow-moving problems where we think we know what's where the risks are, and much of that is true. So in the Timor-Leste case, for instance, we know that there's a leadership transition that will happen at some point in coming years. We know that there are looming issues of fiscal cliff, which really underwrite the post-conflict political settlement in that country. That's all understood. Do we necessarily understand exactly the ways that transition or failure to transition that political settlement might play out? I think it's probably a fair supposition to say that we might be surprised in the specifics. So keeping kind of properly oriented on where we know that there are risks, but nonetheless the circumstances will surprise us. And then the second category of big surprises, of course, is just something will happen somewhere where we just don't know, and we have to have the apparatus in place and the mechanisms in place and the mental models in place to respond appropriately, both when we start seeing those risks and the early indicators ideally, and then of course once it gets towards a crisis end, obviously we want to avoid intervening at that stage if at all possible. And our frame for thinking about that is really at this kind of this model of geostrategic competition interacting with local fragilities, where the drivers of elite capture and influence and so on are providing opportunities for resource competition domestically and so on, and in turn those local fragilities and certainly the outbreak of violence exacerbates the sense of geostrategic tension in the region writ large. And we think, like, for us, that dynamic and that mental model is what's probably going to generate surprises in places that at the moment seem inconceivable to us. And obviously there are plenty of examples in the past where people certainly have recognised long-standing tensions, but perhaps not seen, short-term outbreak coming. And perhaps Nepal in the last couple of years that Bridie mentioned a little earlier, outside the immediate Australian area of interest, perhaps in a near sense, but might be a good example of that.
Senator, I'd just add three things. Bougainville, I'd be looking at youth demographics, particularly in the Pacific. I think this is really significant and everybody understands it, but hasn't internalized it. And I would be looking at the interaction between AI, populism, and how nations are talking to their citizens as social media really takes over, and the misinformation that comes with it. They're three things that I don't feel as though I hear enough conversation about.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you for your time here today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward it to the Secretariat by 5 June 2026. Please note that any responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. Any members who would like to provide additional questions on notice for witnesses, please provide them to the Secretariat by close of business Monday, 11 May 2026. Witnesses will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering questions taken on notice today, and you will have the opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. Thank you for your attendance here today.
Thank you for the opportunity. Best of luck to the committee.
Thank you, Chair.
I now welcome representatives from the International Organisation for Migration and UNICEF Australia to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? If we could start with the IOM.
Yeah, good morning all. I'm very sorry, I'm not sure what's happened to my my camera.
We can hear you.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so my name's David Knight. I'm the IOM Chief of Mission for Australia, and it's great to be with you this morning. Do you want me to fire away with my initial statement or pass over to you?
No. Well, we've got a few things first. Sure. I'll let you know when we start with the statements. Okay. UNICEF Australia, can you give us your name and capacity?
Yes, good morning. My name's Paul Kelly. I'm with UNICEF Australia in the role of government liaison.
Thank you. Although this subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'd now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions from committee members. And to assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before making your opening statement and when responding to each question. If we could begin with an opening statement from the IOM now, and we can see you clearly on screen now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, my name is David Knight, Chief of Mission for IOM. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with the committee this morning. Further to IOM's written submission, I'd like to highlight how Australia's development assistance is a critical investment in preventing conflict and reducing displacement, irregular migration, people smuggling and trafficking in persons. As the UN's lead agency on migration, IOM is operational in 33 countries in the Indo-Pacific with 30 field offices. As a founding member of IOM, Australia's consistent funding enables our life-saving, prevention-focused work in fragile, conflict-affected and climate-vulnerable contexts across this region. And at a time of global ODA cuts and increasing regionalisation of aid programs, this commitment by Australia is critical to promoting stable Indo-Pacific. I'll take this opportunity to thank Australia for its ongoing support. Displacement is now at record levels. Globally, more than 120 million people are forcibly displaced, a figure that's doubled in recent decades, with 1 in 6 conflict-displaced persons originating from the Indo-Pacific region. In our region, this is seen most acutely in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. Protracted displacement, climate shocks, labour mobility pressures, and rapid urbanisation are placing mounting pressures on fragile communities and can rapidly undermine social cohesion if unaddressed. IOM's experience demonstrates that sustained development assistance reduces these risks by strengthening livelihoods, including through migration pathways, maintaining basic services and easing pressure on both displaced and host communities. These host communities are central to stability, particularly where displacement is prolonged and resources are stretched. The Rohingya crisis illustrates these dynamics. Cox's Bazar hosts over 1 million refugees, making it the world's largest refugee settlement. And without sustained assistance, deteriorating conditions there can heighten risks, including the flow back into Rakhine State of potential militants and placing greater pressure on local populations in Bangladesh. In Myanmar, more than 3.7 million people are displaced amid widening humanitarian access constraints and collapsing health services. And in Afghanistan, over 5 million returnees have arrived back over the last 2 years, and IOM is forecasting a further 3 million Afghan refugees from Iran and Pakistan this year alone. This will undoubtedly place increasing pressure on already fragile host communities. Global shocks compound these pressures within the Indo-Pacific. The current conflict in the Middle East is increasing food prices and disrupting remittance flows from labour migrants and livelihoods for migrant workers, key economic lifelines for many Indo-Pacific households. These shocks act as threat multipliers, increasing community tensions, conflict risk, especially where social protection networks are weak. From our work, we know that early, well-targeted development assistance remains one of the most effective tools for conflict prevention and reducing displacement-driven instability and promoting community and regional resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. Opening statement from UNICEF.
Thank you, Chair. Guided by the UN Convention on the Rights of Children, UNICEF works across 190 countries to place children at the heart of efforts to build peaceful, resilient societies. UNICEF Australia's core message in its submission to this inquiry is that investing in children and young people is not only an obligation to fulfil children's rights, but it's a practical, high-impact foundation for conflict prevention. Prioritising children and young people across Australia's development investments reduces structural risk and builds the human capital that future economies and societies depend on. Australia's development program already funds strong child-focused initiatives. However, there's room to systematically embed both a conflict sensitivity lens and a child and youth lens across the strategy, design and implementation of Australia's development program. Our submission includes examples of Australian-supported initiatives delivered by UNICEF that show that child and youth-centred approaches to development can deliver real prevention dividends. But what's important is that the approach must always be adapted to context but the principle is clear and transferable. If Australia is looking to strengthen its conflict prevention toolkit, then a practical and proven place to start includes investing in resilient services for children, using child-specific indicators in conflict analysis and early warning processes, and embedding structured mechanisms for youth participation and feedback. And finally, I'd note our support for calls to grow Australia's development spending beyond annual indexation. Many of the submissions, and indeed as well as government policy, emphasise development assistance as a core tool for preventing conflict. Yet Australia's development budget is at record low levels, while defence spending is set for record highs. Thank you.
Thank you for those opening statements. So I'll allow the Deputy Chair to lead off questioning. Mr. Rebello.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just a general question to both of you at the moment. So I'm interested in how Australia's standing is compared to other countries in our region, both in terms of ODA, but I know that in relation to the International Organisation for Migration, obviously there's a focus on providing the pathway to migration. So from a migration perspective as well, how does Australia stand compared to other countries in our region?
Okay, David Knight, perhaps I'll go first with that. Thank you for the question. I think I recall an official saying that this environment, this Indo-Pacific region, is sometimes a little bit of a lonely place for Australia in terms of funding for the region, because I think Australia does stand out really as a very important donor in this region. I mentioned in my opening statement what I see as a regionalisation of aid. And I say that in the context of what we've noted over the last couple of years, where traditional donors, so particularly European states that have engaged in the Indo-Pacific region, have explicitly moved their aid program away and essentially shut up shop in this part of the world. Last year, I think both Sweden and the Netherlands, for example, had explicit statements saying that they're moving their aid program closer to home, so to speak, almost a neighbourhood policy. So the importance of Australia is significant. We receive good support from the US, from Japan and Korea, for example. In the last 18 months, since obviously we've had the fairly significant impact of funding cuts from the US, I think Australia has also been quite strategic in their engagement with IOM and other multilateral partners. They engaged in a robust exercise of understanding the impact of those cuts in the various countries in the Indo-Pacific. And whilst it was clear that Australia recognised it couldn't fill the gaps that were being left, it was seeking to understand what those gaps were and looking to intervene where they saw those gaps most acutely affecting Australia. So, for example, we had in Papua New Guinea, we were losing some funding there that we'd traditionally received from the US. Australia stepped in and has allowed us to continue some of that disaster preparedness programming in the highlands, as an example. So, very important donor and increasingly important.
Okay. And to UNICEF?
Yeah, look, I'd only add to that. I think Australia's very well regarded, particularly in our region. But I'd say internationally too, Australia's commitment to multilateralism is important. Australia's an important partner for UNICEF. And I think it's based on its ability, its knowledge, its ability to be influential, but its ability to work with, influence and lead other member states as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. A question that's perhaps better directed at UNICEF. So your submission proposes the increase of ODA to 1% of the federal budget. We're obviously seeing a lot of talk at a domestic level in terms of cost of living and the crisis we're in. Can you tell us whether you think, and is there any data to back it up, that Australians are supportive of increasing ODA? Also, if you have any suggestions about where that money should come from. But then, assuming there isn't a change to ODA, is there any particular change to the development program that you think would improve our stance in terms of conflict prevention? So there's a few questions in there.
There is, thanks. I'll try to get to them. In terms of public support for the aid program in Australia, I think ACFID and indeed the Safer World campaign have the data and the numbers behind that. But for a long time in Australia, when it comes to the government's spending on overseas development cooperation, the community consistently overestimate what they think Australia provides. And when they're asked what would be a reasonable level, they provide estimates far beyond what the Australian government actually provides, or indeed many agencies would actually advocate for. So I think, generally speaking, Australians are up for the Australian government spending on development cooperation. And I think most of them are happy to defer to the expertise of the Australian government in deciding the policy parameters for that and the amounts. In terms of, where would the funding come from if it's not the Australian government? Well, it's already a combination. The Australian government provides funding for its development cooperation, but also organisations like UNICEF Australia, which I should distinguish is a national committee of UNICEF. We're not actually UNICEF New York-based organisation, but we're an Australian NGO and we're supported by the Australian community to raise funds and contribute that to UNICEF programs overseas. And if you...
No, I was just going to say, I think in relation to where the money should come from, it's not outside government. So I'm talking about would UNICEF, because if government is wanting to increase its ODA expenditure, they're going to need to redirect funding from somewhere else. Is UNICEF proposing where that money should be redirected from, for example, from defence or from a different budget?
Yeah, I would say again, when you're the budget is currently projected for flatline growth. And obviously every year there are new demands, new priorities. And in a flatline environment, it means if you're going to respond to the new priorities, you obviously have to put something down. So that's, the officials around the Department of Foreign Affairs have a much better idea about what's the composition of that budget, where they think times have changed and maybe priorities have changed. And I think that's fair enough to work within your means. Things change. You need to make sure that you stop doing things that are no longer relevant and focus on the priorities. But we would advocate you can do more with more. So really, if Australia's talking about we need to do more conflict prevention, peace building, well, I think you should fund it. And if Australia was to do nothing else, if it's not possible to increase the budget, then I think what's really important, if we are having this discussion, again, that the Australian government says, actually, we do want to be more effective, more active in the peace-building space, then I think what they really need to do then is have a strategic framework for that. What is the policy that says it is a priority? It tells Australians and it tells the international community it's a priority. And then within a resource-constrained environment, it says these are the kind of things we'll do. These are the regions we'll focus on. These are the kind of activities we'll focus on. But it also indicates then we need to focus where we might take this targeted approach because we won't be able to do it everywhere. And there needs to be a framework for the officials to decide that and then to develop context-specific targeted strategies to respond in those areas.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Knight, did you have a response to if there is just one change to the program, assuming there's no change to the amount of ODA, what you think we should prioritise?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just touch on actually the amount in the sense that it's quite interesting when you look at the OECD DAC list of ODA as a percentage of gross national income. Australia is a fairly long way down that list. So I think, if you go out to the community and say the ODA figure is 5 billion, it sounds like a lot. Why aren't we spending that money in Australia? But if you actually contextualise it in terms of what other OECD countries are giving, we're quite a competitive nation. I think, there'd be a bit of an appetite there for thinking we're quite a long way down that list. So that's just one observation, understanding what our amount is in context, and similarly in terms of its raw amount. In terms of where that money should go, without wanting to sound horribly self-serving, I just think if it's doing less with less or more with the same, the Australian government just needs to make sure it's comfortable with the balance of where that money is going in terms of its development partners. Obviously, the UN system has been, and NGOs as well, have been heavily affected by the US cuts. Is the balance right in where that, not just the activities, but who the implementing partners are? And I say that in the context of the session before was asked about, where there's future risks and the like from shocks that we haven't foreseen, and a few countries were mentioned, Timor-Leste being one of them. You also, I think, want to think about what structures are in place in that country to respond to a crisis if it rapidly evolves. And so in the case of Timor-Leste, do you want to make sure that you have appropriate UN agencies present there in case something blows up? We're at the point right now, coincidentally, I'm going to Timor-Leste next week. We're sort of downsizing our presence in Timor-Leste. I'll be taking over as the chief of mission sort of from Canberra. That's one of the impact of cuts. But if something was to quickly develop in a country like Timor-Leste, having actually a presence of your trusted partners in terms of humanitarian response is important. And to lose that footprint would be a shame. So I think it's just that not just the activities, but who's implementing them for you.
Thank you very much. That's all from me, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Mr. Zapier.
Thanks, Tim. My question is perhaps best addressed by Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, your submission obviously focuses on investing in children and younger people. And I also want to focus more specifically on the Pacific Island region. Can you tell me whether China's investment in that region focuses on young people or part of their investments? Are they following a strategy of investing in young people almost in line with what you're proposing we should do from Australia?
I'm sorry, I really couldn't speak to that because I just don't know enough about China's activities in the Pacific to be able to make an informed response. I'm sorry.
Okay, well then perhaps you could answer this. Is it your view that right now our aid in that Pacific region does not adequately cover investments in supporting young people?
No, I wouldn't say that. As I said in our submission, we do note that the Australian government does already support a range of child-focused initiatives. In fact, across the Pacific in particular, Australia does have its own very good understanding of development context and challenges, a range of partners that it works with. So I think there are a range of good initiatives. And like any initiatives, whether it's private sector, government or community, there are some that are successful and there are some that are less successful, but there's obviously learnings from all of them. Our case is not necessarily that it's not happening, but we're saying there should be a more deliberate framework in the conflict space, peace building and conflict space, taking a conflict sensitivity lens, but in development and in the peace building space, a real child and youth lens across, as I said, the strategy, design and implementation of Australian development programs. So really understanding how the different challenges affect children and understanding what are the appropriate responses to how those impacts are being felt by those children and young people.
And perhaps this last question, because I'm simply not familiar with education levels in the Pacific Islands, is it your view that the young people in that region are not completing their primary and secondary education to the extent that they should be?
Again, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact numbers and details in front of me, but I would say generally that's correct. I think most indicators in the Pacific when it comes to health and education would be below what were Sustainable Development Goal targets, and in some instances not heading in the right direction. Again, this is an area where UNICEF, where the Australian government and other partners are focused on working with governments to do things such as increase access to quality education for young people across the Pacific. And you do that by getting kids back in schools, but you also do that by making their education meaningful. So that, for example, there are a modern curriculum that they're being taught. There are teachers who are qualified and trained to provide that education. So I think with most things that, as I said, the Australian government is doing in its development program, there is a lot of good things, but there is certainly scope for doing more.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Tim.
And Ms. Jarrett.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to pick up on some testimony that we heard earlier in this inquiry in relation to adolescents and the importance of potentially having adolescent tags in data that we collect so we can be a little more clear on programs targeting adolescents, particularly women, and looking at so we can better understand, I guess, the programs and the impact. Do you collect data on adolescents that could help give us a better sense of the extent of the programs and the impacts that they're having? And if not, are you aware of other countries that do this?
Perhaps I'll start. One of the things, particularly in developing country contexts, and certainly those that are at risk of conflict, is access to data is incredibly difficult. It's very sparse, it's not reliable, it's not up to date. So in terms of most development partners would look to understand what the local data is, what the data exists in the countries themselves, and that's often weak or non-existent. So they would look elsewhere for the data that exists. I think sometimes then UNICEF would definitely have it. Most development partners would collect data in their own interventions to try to inform their own interventions. Of course, you need to understand context first, and you need to understand what you're trying to change and are things changing, so you need to be able to measure that. So depending on the intervention, depending on the place, you would have different frameworks for that. So I think it really is a context-based issue, really, and I don't know that there's any one single reliable source of data on those kind of things. That said, I would expect that UNICEF certainly has, from its experience and its range of programs and policies, it would certainly have a data foundation to draw on that informs both program specific but also broader policy discussions at a global level too.
Would it help, if we had that level of data, would it help with our strategic programming going forward though? Or is it because of the differences in the types of programs, the needs of various countries, etc., it might just create a whole level of bureaucracy that's not needed?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It wouldn't hurt, of course, but nor do you want to end up down a rabbit hole building. I know that across Australia's development program, there have been, and there probably continue to be, interventions that try to work with the statistics bureaus in various countries. And again, some of them are successful and some of them are less successful at different times. It's always important to have data to inform the context and inform what you're doing. And again, as you mentioned, if and when we're responding to efforts to improve our conflict prevention, peace building in regions, in countries, it's really important that we stop and understand the context. And so that's data, sure, but it's about getting on the ground and talking to people too, understanding the situation on the ground. What are the drivers for change? What are the reasons for inequities, grievances, or competition? So yes, data is one thing, but it's not the only thing in helping to understand and respond to the context.
Okay, just one more quick question. One of your submissions mentioned strengthening mechanisms to elevate young people's voices. Are there any specific mechanisms that currently exist to do that, or is this about starting from scratch?
I'll go again. And again, I mean, in our submission, we do talk about the importance of inclusion. So again, including children and young people is a subset of that social inclusion that many submissions have touched on in terms of peace building and conflict change. So again, the work that UNICEF does is all about engaging children and young people, allowing them and others to understand their rights, how to respond to that rights, how different issues affect them, and what solutions they themselves would advocate for. So that's at a general level, the approach that UNICEF would take. And then at a country-specific level, again, in our submission, we talk about strengthening social cohesion and youth engagement. And so, for example, some of the things that we refer to as UNICEF supporting inclusive education, peace-building programs, but also youth participation initiatives that can promote tolerance, dialogue, and civic engagement.
Are there examples of those?
Yeah, in our submission.
I'm just trying to work out if we like to strengthen the elevate young people's voices. Is this a matter of giving greater focus to existing development programs, or do we need a much more coordinated approach to do that?
I think that I would be saying, for me, what's required, one of the things that's required that we advocate for, that others have advocated for, is if Australia is saying we want to do more in peace building and conflict prevention, then there does need to be a policy framework that guides that. So I would say that means that the Australian government, at formulating that overarching policy, and then for the individual countries and regions that are identified who need to develop a specific strategy, that gets you then into the space of saying, well, how do we do it?
Yeah.
So because, again, it's very context specific, the kind of things that you would do for youth engagement in one country or region look very different elsewhere. So there are examples, but it really comes down to having some toolkits, having partners that can provide guidance on how do you provide the framework and the context, the environment for people for youth voices to be elevated.
Yeah, and have it as a priority in the strategy. Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Templeman.
Thanks, Chair. One of the issues that has been raised this morning by a few witnesses has been this real youth focus, and this has given more prominence to it than I think some of the other discussions we've had. And so I just want to ask a broader question around it. There's obviously never going to be sufficient funds to do everything that we think is a priority, and obviously UNICEF in particular and others are arguing that young people be the priority. So my question is twofold. What are the things that we let go that may have traditionally been part of the work that Australia has been involved in? But secondly, is there a way of making the existing work we do more relevant to young people? And I say this in the context of having recently been in Papua New Guinea with Save the Children, looking at a range of programs, and also thinking about work I saw in Palestine a few years ago. Is there a way of engagement that builds on existing programs rather than ditching some of those to focus on others? So I'm just interested in your sort of bigger picture expertise around that.
David, I don't want to dominate. Would you like to jump in first?
Sure. I mean, I guess youth is in your bailiwick more than mine, but so we actually do quite a bit in terms of youth empowerment. For a couple of decades, we've had a fairly robust program in terms of community stabilisation, and very much part of that is youth engagement livelihoods. And we touched on it in our submission. There's also an element, particularly for at-risk communities, in terms of preventing violent extremism. So, and we do that in countries Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Jordan, Lebanon, more recently in Mozambique. A lot of that was done with funding from the US under their Office of Transitional Initiatives. So really the youth element in terms of that community stabilisation post-conflict was very much embedded in our program planning. And to the point that I heard just when I was joining about the increasing use of social media and radicalisation, and just the sort of increase in populism and nationalism and how quickly things can get distorted through social media. I think that that it really speaks to the need to engage with those who are most exposed to social media, which are the youth, in terms of promoting stability and not divisiveness. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks. Just in response, yes, UNICEF, of course, advocates for the rights of children and young people and to make it a priority. But we recognise that there are many priorities, competing priorities, and many of them also need to be taken into account. For UNICEF, I suppose what we're saying is often the views and engagement of children and young people is often overlooked. And we're saying we need to make sure that there is a more considered way to understand young people's perspectives and give them the opportunity to engage in the process. And so in that regard, in terms of competing priorities, we all understand it's a very difficult budgetary environment, resource-constrained environment, and there will always be competing priorities. And as I said before, things change over time. It's appropriate in the context of Australia's development program that at the country level, programs are looking at, we used to do this, it's not a priority of our partner government anymore, or that issue has moved on. We can do less of it so we can do more of something else, in this instance, conflict prevention. I think that's fine, and that all those decisions need to be made at that country level because context is really important here. And when you're asking about how do we make some of the stuff that we do more relevant, what's really important under context is that external partners don't come in thinking that we have all the answers. What's really important when we decide we need to develop a peace-building strategy or approach in a particular country, first things first, just listen, understand the context, understand the different players, who's involved, not just at national government levels, but at sub-national levels and community. And what's really important then in terms of how to make it more relevant, look where the local energy is. Externals like us like to come in often and not like to, but often unfortunately displace that local energy. And I think the best thing to do is finding that local energy and backing it, not overtaking it and taking it in a different direction. And one of the most important things I've noticed that the Australian government, the Australian embassies on the ground and organisations like UNICEF can do on the ground is we have good links with the national governments and with formal government, but we also have very good links with community groups and civil society. And I've often been struck when I meet young people in some of the countries that we work in who are frustrated because they can talk to us about what the problem is, what they think the government needs to do, but they don't have access to their own politicians, their own MPs often, and they're looking for us to facilitate contact. And so I think in some instances, the Australian government or organisations like UNICEF really have a role as facilitating connections and helping these community groups and young people at community levels to actually connect to people who are decision makers in their own countries.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We're approaching time, but I just have one question for the IOM. Bangladesh and the humanitarian crisis triggered by the exodus of Rohingya from Rakhine State into Bangladesh is Australia's single largest humanitarian commitment. It's a topic of particular interest to the Australian Parliament, to the Australian government, and one of those issues that the Australian government can sometimes feel lonely as a funder, I think, as it was put earlier. I'm particularly interested in the discussion in the IOM submission about the displacement tracking matrix and the way that it's been used in assisting the response and particularly in conflict prevention amongst displaced communities in Bangladesh. Are you able to share practical examples with the committee around how those tools are being used to inform a policy response? Where one of the themes of the submissions we've had in this inquiry is the the value of data collection and early warning systems to inform a policy response. And I know that the Australian government's been involved in supporting this IOM project, and you're able to share some of the dividends of that kind of data collection and early warning with the committee in that Bangladesh context?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for the question. Just on displacement tracking matrix itself, that's one of our, I think, institutional tools that we support really the whole UN system in many conflicts around the world. And essentially, it seeks to provide vision of who's moving where and the characteristics of those people. In some countries, it's incredibly detailed. I recall recently seeing a briefing from Ukraine where we were providing details of movements to EU government officials, and you could just see the look on their face. It was the level of granularity that they were quite surprised about. I think in Bangladesh, that data sharing load is actually also done by UNHCR as well as IOF. And I'm happy to send some, after this, examples of the data sharing products that are developed there. But essentially, what we're seeking to do is understand, give very early signs as to who's moving where. So if there's any secondary movement from Cox's Bazar, so if people are going, to Thailand or to Indonesia or to Malaysia, to track that and understand why they're moving there, or indeed moving back to Rakhine State. And I think that's late last year, our biggest concern in Cox's Bazar was essentially that on our side, the money was becoming the donor funding was becoming extremely tight, and we could anticipate an environment where we just weren't able to provide the level of care and service for this population. And we were, I touched on it before, we were very worried that we'd see youth going back into Rakhine State potentially to fight, or that we would start to see increasing levels of conflict in surrounding districts, or increasing levels of instability in surrounding districts in Bangladesh, as essentially the Rohingya were forced to go out and forage for burning materials and things like that. And in fact, I've got a photo which I can share with you also, sort of showing the deforestation around Cox's Bazar as a consequence of needing, burning materials to cook. My understanding is that situation for IOM and other implementing partners in Cox's Bazar has now ameliorated somewhat, that we have the funding, and that's including through the very important Australian government support, also US support and others. So that's been, that crisis, if you like, has been curtailed. But we're very closely monitoring this. We're also speaking with the Australian government about a roots-based approach with UNHCR, which is really trying to have rather than a country or a crisis focused approach, it's looking potentially at how movements track down through, if you like, the Southeast Asian region. So we're tracking who's arriving in Indonesia, who's arriving in Malaysia, as I said, and Thailand. We're not there yet with that sort of integrated mapping. And so it tends to be more looking at what's happening around Cox's Bazar. That's something we are in discussions with the Australian government on, in terms of trying to provide a better whole of route approach. And that obviously also provides an early warning potentially to Australian authorities if we start to see an increase, for example, in numbers going to Indonesia, including from Cox's Bazar. What does that mean for Australia, for example? But I'll share some materials with you.
Thank you. It strikes me that in a region that's been that has seen conflict driven by large-scale people movements multiple times over the last century, it's really invaluable piece of preventative architecture to inform policymakers. We've come to time for this hearing. Thank you for your time today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward that to the Secretariat by Friday, 5 June 2026. Please note that any responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. Members of the committee, if you would like to provide additional questions on notice for witnesses, please provide them to the Secretariat by COB Monday, 11 May 2026. Witnesses will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering questions taken on notice today and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. I now suspend this subcommittee's public hearing until 11 a.m. Thank you. The committee will now resume its public hearing for its inquiry into the role of Australia's international development program in preventing conflict. The hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the committee's website. I now welcome representatives from the Australian Electoral Commission and the International IDEA to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee? We'll maybe start with the Australian Electoral Commission. Do we have the Australian Electoral Commission? Can representatives from International IDEA introduce themselves?
Hello, hi, this is Liina Rikkila-Tamang from International IDEA, and I speak on behalf as Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific.
Thank you. Do we have Australian Electoral Commission representatives on the line? Okay, I think we might move forward with opening statements from International IDEA, but before we do so, I should advise you that although this subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, the giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I believe AEC has rejoined the call. Sorry, we can't hear you. Are you able to introduce yourself and the capacity in which you're appearing? I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Okay, we might move forward with opening statements. Can I invite witnesses from the International IDEA to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions? To assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before making your opening statement and when responding to each question.
Thank you so much, Chair and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Liina Rikkila-Tamang, and I speak on behalf of International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, and joining you currently early morning, Kathmandu, Nepal, where I'm on duty trip. Our core message is simple: conflict prevention and building democratic resilience are inseparable. However, building democratic resilience most often these days requires countering democratic backsliding. Allow me to very briefly highlight 4 priority areas or recommendations in our submission. Number 1, strengthening the rule of law and legitimate institutions, supporting inclusive constitution reform. Independent oversight bodies, anti-corruption institutions, and decentralized governance can help build trust between states and citizens and reduce incentives for violent conflict. And we see a couple quite remarkable once-in-a-generation opportunities at the moment in the region. Second, placing young people at the front and center of development partnerships from Bangladesh to Sri Lanka, Nepal, Indonesia, Myanmar. Generation Z has been at the forefront of political mobilization, countering democratic backsliding. And young people are demanding fairness, accountability, participation in decision-making. Third, protecting electoral integrity. When an electoral process lacks integrity, it does not provide a mandate, it provides a grievance, and disputed or manipulated elections can destabilize societies for years. And we very much agree with the submission made by the Australian Election Commission, with whom we cooperate closely, stating that the current electoral environment is facing increasing risks and complexity, and reputation management, trust building are key areas of work. Fourth, investing in information integrity. Today, conflicts are increasingly fueled online through for-profit disinformation and polarization. Foreign interference, manipulation, FIMI, is an increasing threat, and supporting independent media, citizens' media literacy, digital resilience, and increasingly digital sovereignty is an essential part of conflict prevention. As Nobel laureate Maria Ressa stated, the information integrity has become the mother of all battles. So in conclusion, the prevention of conflict is perhaps the highest return on investment any development program can achieve. As we have seen over the recent months, single conflict can erase decades of development gains. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Australian Electoral Commission, would you like to make an opening statement? I'm sorry, we still can't hear you. Okay, the AEC is going to try and rejoin. Let's lead off with questions to International IDEA. I noticed that your submission elevated the fact that across the Indo-Pacific, Generation Z, as you flagged, has been at the forefront of protest movements demanding political and economic change, and indeed the recognition and inclusion of young people's concerns in democratic decision making. What does this pattern tell us about the relationship between youth exclusion from democratic processes and the kind of instability that threatens conflict, that threatens regional security? And is Australia's current investments in youth through our ODA program commensurate with the scale of that risk?
Thank you for that question. Indeed, if you look at the Gen Z protests in Asia and worldwide, and particularly when they've been turning violent, it's mainly due to excessive use of force by state. So, and all of these movements we've seen them brewing for quite a while. On surface, perhaps they were in Indonesia, triggered by these parliamentary housing allowances, social media ban in Nepal, job quotas in Bangladesh. But those movements and discontent has been making for quite some time, and as we've been seeing it in digital world, preceded by complaints and conversations, and even also of leaving of the country. And I do think, indeed, there is much that one should put the youth at the center of support programs. And while I do believe that DFAT programs have been investing and development cooperation programs have been developing in youth, and particularly, of course, the youth mobility and allowing opportunities to study in Australia, we do believe there should be perhaps even more targeted support, particularly in perhaps in selected countries, and particularly on when it comes to kind of making the youth perhaps a benchmark in bilateral programs with partner governments, and support any of these mechanisms that really bring youth more young voices into national policy dialogues. We are, in fact, at the moment implementing a DFAT-supported program here in Kathmandu, a very small program in the aftermath of the Gen Z protest movements in September, and the young people's interest in participating in the constitution reform discussions. And we are doing that through the CSOs, our role really being the organization that is doing exactly that, what your chair alluded to, facilitating the relationships between state and youth, and state and non-state institutions, CSOs and parliaments, young people and parliaments, young people and election management bodies, because that's often where the gap is. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe you've had a mobile phone join the call. Is this the AEC? Is the AEC able to come off mute on the phone line? Okay, to international IDA. Your submission identifies information integrity as a critical and underweighted pillar in conflict prevention, arguing that, quote, modern conflicts are often preheated in digital spaces, and that, quote, interference in the digital space is now a widespread and cost-effective way to destabilise democracies. Your submission highlights that recommends that Australia invest in information integrity and cognitive resilience, including independent media and fact-checking ecosystems. In your assessment, is Australia's current development program doing enough in this space, and what does a well-resourced information integrity program actually look like in practice in a country like Papua New Guinea, where there is a rapidly changing information environment?
Thank you. Yes, that is the big question. How do we counter, or how do we uphold information integrity and counter the kind of for-profit disinformation ecosystem fueling polarization? I think there are several programs tried and tested, some more successful than others. And I think what Australia is doing well is in supporting the independent media, which is of course a key ingredient here. And I do believe there are, particularly Taiwan has been really leading the way on what it comes to citizens' media literacy and digital resilience, what is called digital resilience. We see in South Korea interesting examples of building now the kind of, particularly on what it comes to AI fueled mis and disinformation, it's kind of digital sovereignty infrastructure, recognizing that we do China's AI systems and authoritarian control, US-based AI systems are very commercialized, and where we can see that countries like EU is very good at maybe regulating AI, but is heavily dependent on the US-based companies which are producing. So Koreans are kind of trying to come up with this kind of digital sovereign digital infrastructure, particularly on what it comes to AI. I guess there are no any what do you call magic bullet here, but without some accountability by that countries then can keep the media, social media, tech companies accountable. It is a very tough battle, but investing indeed in media literacy, digital resilience, countering foreign interference, manipulation, which is of course an increasing threat as we've seen in Europe and increasingly in Asia too, and all the coming up with the protecting elections framework around that. I do. On what it comes to Papua New Guinea, that I guess there again, independent media, increasing understanding of citizens' media literacy would be the ways to address some of these threats. And I do believe that or would like to particularly mention the Australian E-Safety Commission as a model. That is probably something that one could find ways to support such institutions. Fiji has its online safety commission, something of similar in Papua New Guinea, in order to address the several kind of, particularly the online violence against women and that is taking place there. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see the AEC's back. Do we want to try again?
How's that, Chair?
Well, hearing you loud and clear.
My apologies. So I'm Gleeson. I'm the Acting Deputy Electoral Commissioner here at the AEC. I have a couple of opening words, but happy to skip. Okay.
No, if you could give some opening remarks, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members, and thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today. I have my colleague with me, Joanne Rodolfi, who is the Director of our International Engagement team here at the AEC. Strengthening democracy by supporting resilient electoral administration is an essential part of promoting peace and ensuring that the voice of people is heard. The AEC has a proud history of supporting democratic elections through Australia's International Development Program, largely targeted in our region. So we've worked alongside our Timor-Leste colleagues to establish a strong electoral institution post-Civil War, and we've supported elections in Fiji to ensure the peaceful transition of power in the wake of the 2006 coup, and some of those are reflected in our submission, as you'd be aware. Our most significant contribution to peace in our region is arguably in nations that are not experiencing active conflict, and developing strong democratic institutions, supporting electoral integrity and building trust in the system is a really important component of preserving that peace. The AEC does this work through electoral support programs that are focused on building capability across the whole electoral cycle, and that's a really important element. These programs are fully funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and it wouldn't be possible for the AEC to do that essential work without their support, guidance and oversight. When an election fails, peace is under threat, and while elections alone cannot prevent conflict, and we're fully cognizant of that, we argue that you can't have a peaceful democratic nation without successful elections. So through Australia's International Development Program, a range of partners are working with electoral management bodies to reduce the risk of failed elections occurring in our region. I'm proud of the experience that the AEC brings to this work. We've been doing it for a very long time. We run peaceful federal elections and referendums, and this piece is in part due to the trust that the public have in the AEC as an institution. We deliver elections transparently, and we're held accountable for our conduct. And as a result, election outcomes are accepted by the community in Australia, and there's a peaceful transition of power. So as a valued electoral practitioner, the AEC is well placed to lend this experience and our credentials to other electoral management bodies through a focus on capability building and institutional strengthening. The demand for AEC support from our Indo-Pacific counterparts is as high as it's ever been. And with DFAT support, we stand ready to provide electoral assistance to our friends and neighbours. And I look forward to taking any questions that you have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll give the call to Mr. Newman.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kath. It's very interesting, your contribution. I want to thank you for the submission, but also the work you do in the Indo-Pacific region. I don't think anyone would be as well placed to understand what's going on in terms of the electoral mapping and landscaping in the Indo-Pacific region than the Australian Electoral Commission. And I'm really interested in your overview as to where you think you're at. I mean, for example, you do work in Fiji, PNG, a whole range of other areas. Can you give us your general perspective on the state of democracy in the area and the electoral systems and the electoral bodies that are there in the Pacific?
Thanks very much, Mr. Newman, for the question, and nice to see you again. I would say that there's cause for optimism about the state of democracy in the region. We know that democracy is under threat globally, and so I guess I have that optimistic outlook, but with a very big dose of caution because there are significant headwinds based on international trends. I would say that the environment that electoral management bodies in the region operate in is as complex as it's ever been. As many of you know, elections used to be measured on operational and logistical success, and the complexity was largely about whether you could get materials where they needed to get to in time and count votes in time and to a high standard. But increasingly, the threats to electoral integrity are things outside of electoral management bodies' control, and they are things like foreign interference and mis and disinformation, physical security challenges, which many of our counterparts in the region deal with, and cybersecurity threats also. And these things are very challenging for sometimes very, very small electoral management bodies. Some of our partners might have 3 or 4 staff in their electoral management body, which compared to an institution like the AEC is very, very small. And oftentimes they will straddle multiple roles and wear multiple hats in, and they may not have the sophisticated mechanisms to enable adequate funding to be let down in time to undertake the preparations that are needed to deliver high integrity elections, especially in the complex environment that they are operating in. Now, having said that, one of the important elements of our work that was mentioned in our submission is the Pianzia network, and Pacific Islands, Australia, New Zealand Electoral Administrators Network, which has been active for over 20 years and which the AEC Australia chairs. I am very humbled by the expertise and the prowess of the electoral commissioners and the electoral management bodies that form part of Pianzia. These are deeply dedicated, almost without exception, deeply dedicated humans committed to the cause of democracy, totally alive to the challenges, and every day sort of coming to work committed to doing a better job for voters in their jurisdiction, and often in really challenging circumstances. So those things give me great confidence. The level of information sharing, engagement, and then where needed, dedicated support through our bilateral agreements and arrangements with countries across the region, I think puts us in really good stead, and Australia should be really proud of the work that we do in this space.
Now, when we have federal elections, you employ an army of people because you've got a core dedicated staff to do a great job on the ground, but you can't staff every pre-poll or polling booth without employing Australians who are frankly committed to participating and contributing to our democracy by taking on a role, as a presiding officer or someone there. Admittedly, they get paid, but seriously, that's a significant contribution that they make. Now, how do you go when, for example, Papua New Guinea, which might have be bigger than, say, Fiji or Nauru or whoever, or Solomons, how do you go with your staff? I mean, practically what happens, Kath, when you go there? They would not be able to get to every highland place. What do? Do you say, look, we're sending up so many people and we will help you run it? Or do they run it? Or every system's different.
Yes, very good question. The work that we do is focused on outside of election delivery period. I'll come to what we do when the election actually happens, but it used to be the case that we would get, I suppose, quite tactical requests for, can we supply some ballot boxes or help with ballot papers? But over time, as we've matured the approach and grown our international function, we are focused on building institutional capability throughout the electoral cycle. And that means that, I was up in PNG, I think late last year, meeting with the acting PNG electoral commissioner, for instance, with my staff, a number of my permanent staff from the AEC, meeting with relevant leaders at the PNG Electoral Commission so that we can understand where their key areas of need are and where they need assistance to build that institutional capability. We're assisting them, for instance, to build a variation of what we call at the AEC our Election Ready Roadmap, which is just outlines all of the activities and milestones that need to be met in order to be ready to deliver an election. But these are the sorts of tools and governance and planning elements that some or many electoral commissions across the region don't necessarily have because they've been so focused on the very basics of delivering elections. So we're building that capability in the lead-in. As part of our PNG program, which you've mentioned, and I'll use that as an example, we've recently signed a new agreement with DFAT to provide dedicated support in the lead into the 2027 election. And that will mean I'll have some of my technical experts attend at different intervals to work with them on logistics planning, for instance, looking at their logistics plans and how they can improve on that front. We'll have people assisting with the development of training material for temporary election staff. But we also talk with them about things like cybersecurity and good governance as an institution and a whole range of areas that help them to deliver good elections. Then when it comes closer to election delivery, we very importantly, the AEC is at pains to operate as a partner to the Electoral Commission. There's a fine line that we need to walk here, where we don't want to be seen as coming in over the top or telling people how to do their work. We're there to provide advice and assistance if needed, and always with the support and direction of DFAT. So as we approach elections with our partners, the support time sometimes gets more tactical, so assisting with the logistics of getting ballot papers to locations or finding printing providers to assist with the preparation of materials, for instance. And most times we will not be in country during an election unless the partner really needs us there. But that is not usually the case. By that stage, they usually have good plans in place and they execute as an independent electoral management body on their own. And we operate from a distance, sort of providing advice and assistance if needed. But more often than not, we are not. We don't actually go into the country during the election, and that's an important part of walking that very fine line.
Yeah, my final question, Chair. My grandparents were really actively involved in the Salvation Army. My grandmother used to always tell me that you get more out of giving than receiving. Now, your role as the AEC is so critical for our national security and securing democracy. What do you learn? And what does the AEC learn by giving, if I could put it like that, quoting Grandma Smith, to these bodies? What do you learn that will help you fulfil your role in conflict resolution and the promotion of democracy?
What a wonderful question, and a lot is the short answer. As I said, in my engagement with colleagues in the Pianzia network, I'm constantly humbled by their commitment and dedication to providing high integrity elections. And in some countries, in PNG, for instance, we know that those elections are extremely challenging. They can be very dangerous and contested, and there are impressive, resilient, dedicated people who show up to work every day in service of their colleagues in the PNG Electoral Commission and voters across PNG. They, our partners across the region are innovative. They're always looking for ways to do more with less. They are resilient. We assisted, for instance, the Solomon Islands Electoral Commission very sadly had a fire that destroyed their Electoral Commission building. We happened to be in country at the time, some of my staff supporting as part of our planning work and arrangements with them. We were able to support them to get back up and running, but they were back delivering business within hours at a different location, and but they do this in very different resourcing circumstances to an advanced democracy like Australia. So we learn technically from them. They have some really impressive innovations around use of technology in elections in some places. Samoa, for instance, have done a recent impressive pilot of electronic roll. And as you would know, Mr. Newman, we use electronic mark-off in some places in Australia. So we share that information and learn from them. So we are certainly, yes, we are seen as experts on this, but we learn from them as well. And having those strong networks, information sharing, horizon scanning for risks and challenges to electoral administrators is really invaluable. And I hope that that our commitment and the Australian government's commitment to these sorts of arrangements endures for many, many years to come.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Templeman.
Thank you. Thanks for appearing before us. You will have heard this morning that if you were able to listen to any of the hearing, that youth has been a really big focus. So one thing I'm interested in is your thoughts on what you see in terms of election literacy and the support that we're providing about the engagement of young people in any of those processes through the work that we're doing.
Yes, thanks for the question, Ms. Templeman. Just to be clear, are you interested in the how youth are participating in the countries that we support?
Yeah, whether any of the support we're giving that you're seeing it has a consequence of engaging young people, it might not be specifically youth focused, but if there is if in the outcomes you see that.
Yes, thank you for the question. Many of the partners that we work with have the youth is a significant proportion of their voter base, and youth motivation to participate in elections is a key focus for them. Not very many of our partners have, and countries in the region have compulsory voting like we do in Australia. And so motivating youth to participate is a real challenge for our partners in the region. And I have to say, there's some really, to my point earlier with Mr. Newman, there's some really impressive and innovative ways that that this is being done. Nauru, for instance, do some really interesting things with youth engagement, and I think from memory, and my colleague Joanne may remind us, but I think they had a pilot on involving youth in the Electoral Commission to get sort of work experience and exposure to understand a little more sort of up close and personally what elections are all about. The AEC does do work around community engagement, and we support many of our partners in the region to build their community engagement or voter education capability and capacity. And part of that is absolutely focusing on voter turnout more generally, but motivating youth in particular to participate. We've done work recently, I think, with Tonga on this and assisting them to improve their social media capability and presence. As you will know, the AEC is quite active on social media, and we have a very young team who are able to craft material and messages in a way that resonates with youth. And so we share that information and that experience with electoral management bodies in the region as well to assist them with their youth programs. So yes, it's a focus, but it would be remiss of me not to mention that in our discussions through the Pianzia network, youth turnout is something that most of the commissions do worry about. And they are very, very focused on. So we'll absolutely continue our efforts in this space. And again, the sharing of information amongst that network is invaluable because we can look at what Nauru are doing, for instance, and you see that then trialled in the Solomon Islands. So it's fabulous to see that exchange. It's a really lo-fi way of making sure that stuff that works is tried in other contexts.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Templeman. This is a question for both witnesses. Canvassing the submissions heard by this inquiry so far, democratic institutions are increasingly recognised not just as a governance good in these submissions, but as a positive driver for peace and security. International IDEA's submission argues that, quote, conflict prevention is inextricably linked to the quality of democratic institutions, and that, quote, where institutions are inclusive, transparent and accountable, grievances are resolved through ballots and dialogue rather than bullets and violence. The AEC submissions reinforces this, noting that, quote, failed or disputed elections can erode trust in government and lead to instability, social unrest or even violent conflict. IDEA's submission also argues that Australia's international development program is most effective in preventing conflict when it treats democratic resilience not as a secondary objective, but as a foundational infrastructure of peace. We know that Myanmar stands as an example in our region of how democratic breakdown can escalate into what is currently the largest active conflict in the Indo-Pacific. Proving a counterfactual is obviously difficult, but we've heard evidence in this inquiry that recent investments are made by the Australian Development Program in Bangladesh's election helped contribute to an extraordinary outcome there, and certainly a relatively peaceful outcome. Can I ask whether either of your organisations can point to other specific examples where Australian ODA funding demonstrably contributed to preventing a potential conflict, and looking at this through a cost-benefit lens of, funding contributed upfront avoided an outcome that would have cost Australia far more to respond to had conflict manifested.
Thank you, Chair. I think I don't have a sort of neat linear cost-benefit example to share, but perhaps I can speak a little to the, I suppose, some of the reflections in the submission. And just checking that people can hear me okay still?
Yep.
Oh, excellent. So if I use, say, Papua New Guinea, for example, some of the support and assistance that we have provided for previous elections and the capability building that we do with the Commission assists the PNGC to identify areas of risk and areas of risk to electoral integrity or to running high integrity elections, and then enables us to give some advice on where they need to target their efforts to avoid election failure or issues that could compromise the integrity of an election. So that active identification of risks and challenges, I think, helps avoid election failure. And then some of the work that we might do on the eve of an election, and we have assisted the PNG Electoral Commission with ballot paper printing and logistics, quite close to the last PNG general election, that if it were not for that assistance, would have been very, very problematic. Had ballot papers not arrived at polling stations, that could have escalated and unravelled, I think, quite quickly. We hope not to be in those sorts of situations in the future and be called on for that sort of last minute support, but rather sort of build that capability up front to avoid those sorts of situations. But those are the sorts of contributions that we make through the ODA work that I think we'll never know what could have transpired had we not done that work. But we know that it contributes to delivering elections that are trusted or that meet the threshold of satisfaction from the public, and thereby avoid problems with social cohesion, lack of trust, or worse, violence or rejection of election results.
Chair?
Yes, do you have the call if
Yeah,
you would like
thank
to respond?
Yes, thank you. If I may, I would like to make a comment on the Bangladesh, which is very true that the international community support to the election management body and the elections of Bangladesh led to peaceful transfer of power after decades of authoritarian rule and the very violent violence that the students encountered. But I would like to just maybe say a word of caution here to continue that investment now. What we witnessed in those elections was a peaceful transfer of power, but not the actual underlying constitutional and legal challenges that were preceded, that were underlying the decades of concentration of power and authoritarianism, growing authoritarianism in Bangladesh. Those issues have not yet been addressed. I'm just back from Bangladesh a couple of weeks ago, and they're meeting all the ruling party and the parties in opposition and civil society organizations and the students. And there is, unfortunately, a bit of a growing skepticism about where these reforms, or whether the reforms actually are going to be implemented as was agreed by all parties in the July Charter. We visited two of the main universities, of the cradles of the student movements, and we asked the question of hundreds of students: do you want the political reforms to take place? All hands up. Do you believe the reforms will take place? One hand up. And whether you want to work towards advancing those reforms, and again, practically all hands were up. And there is indeed a historic momentum here to really support the parliament to move ahead with those constitutional and legal reforms, and support the CSOs and youth groups working from outside of the parliament to really keep the parliament accountable, and so that the years ahead, now that the mandate the current government has, that there is a peaceful and constructive reform process that moves on, and it doesn't, so that we can break that vicious cycle of Bangladesh, where I believe it's been now practically every democratic governance tenure has ended either with the violent clash or military takeover. And this is the historic once-in-a-generation moment or window of opportunity to break that cycle. So I hope that Australia continues to support the reform process. Thank you.
Thank you. We're coming close to time. I've just got one more question. Drawing on the AEC submission that notes that, quote, building democratic resilience is an important part of maintaining peace and stability in fragile states, and this is especially important in the current international electoral environment, which is facing increasing risk and complexity due to geostrategic shifts, technological acceleration, and the changed approach to international aid and development by the United States. The AEC submission flags that up to 97% of US-funded programs relating to democracy, governance, and peace building have been cancelled, and this obviously leaves a substantial gap in the global democracy support ecosystem at a time when the Indo-Pacific is facing considerable democratic stress. Can I ask how the AEC is responding to the gaps that it is seeing in the Indo-Pacific in this space, in areas that were previously covered by US-funded programs, and how Australia might respond to this new environment?
Thank you, Chair. I think from the AEC's perspective, and of course, DFAT would no doubt have excellent insights on that question. Of course, we raised that in the context of the submission because the work that we do in the region is a really important slither of the democracy puzzle, but certainly, as you would appreciate, not all of it. Elections are sort of the foundation, if you like, of a strong democracy, but there's so much more to the democracy picture. And there is also elements of strong electoral management and running sound elections that the AEC also doesn't necessarily deliver with our partners. For instance, we don't typically provide support on parties and campaigners. So you'll appreciate that in countries that are new democracies, the idea of forming parties and helping political candidates to understand what it is to run as a candidate for Parliament, that's a new concept, and so some capability building is often needed in that space. So there are elements of this work that aren't for the AEC to do. It's not our sort of our remit or our area of expertise, and so we rely on other partners, often NGOs like International IDEA and IFIS as well, UNDP and others, who do important work to supplement the technical and institutional capability building work that the AEC does. That is important because it helps make sure that we are addressing areas of risk and potential gaps. And the AEC often coordinates donors through donor coordination meetings. For instance, we do that for PNG elections so that we can make sure that everyone's clear on who's doing what, and we avoid duplication, but we also understand where the gaps could be. So that landscape now changes with the changes to the funding for some of those institutions, and we're still in a bit of a state of flux and probably don't know the full impact of that at this stage. And Lena may be better placed to speak to some of that, but it will have an impact, and it will mean that some of that work will either not get done potentially, or may, of course, fall to private companies and others who don't necessarily have the interest of democracy and the country at heart. So I think there's certainly some risk for us to consider.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so I'll need to bring the hearing to a close. But thank you for your time today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward it to the Secretariat by Friday, 5 June 2026. Please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. Any members of the committee who would like to provide additional questions on notice for witnesses, please provide them to the Secretariat by close of business Monday, 11 May 2026. Witnesses will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering questions taken on notice today, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. Thank you for your appearance today.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are we okay in the room? Okay. I now welcome representatives from the International Development Contractors community, Tetra Tech International Development and DT Global to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Nathan Hansford and I appear as the CEO of the International Development Contractors community.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Sophia Fernandez and I represent Commonics Australia, an IDCC member.
Erin Anderson, Technical Director, Asia Pacific for Cowater International, an IDCC member organisation.
Emma Lewis, Tetra Tech International Development Executive Manager.
Thanks, Chair. Heidi Winder, Director of Humanitarian Preparedness and Response from Tetra Tech.
Byron Pakula from DT Global, Strategy, Design and Quality Lead. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions. To assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before making your opening statement and when responding to each question. If we could start with IDCC, then Tetra Tech and then DT Global.
Thanks, Chair. Nathan Hansford, IDCC. I'm here representing the contractors that work on the aid program for DFAT. We have a couple of colleagues here as well today. Sophia and Erin introduced themselves. They both come from companies that helped out on our submission, but we also have Tetra Tech and DT Global, who are also both IDCC members and managing contractors as well. I think this morning, I'll speak to some of the sector-wide positioning, but you have the benefit of having a lot of managing contractors in the room and on the screen as well today. So I think some of the key details perhaps that you're looking for will probably be directed more towards them, and they'll certainly have that ability to address the issues on the ground that I think you're probably more keen on hearing. I just wanted to, you've all, of course, read our submission. I just wanted to speak to a couple of issues coming out of that submission that I think are really important to frame today. First, I think IDCC as an organisation on behalf of our members really supports a continued focus and funding of Australia's aid program. Australia, as you know, stands out compared to almost every other aid donor in the world at the moment, having not cut the aid budget over the last little while. We've all seen what's happened in the US. I think it's really important that that remains and that the aid program focused on conflict prevention continues to have that funding. And I think if there are any recommendations that are coming out of the committee itself that are focused on conflict prevention, that are additional to what DFAT is already doing, I think that needs to be funded. There needs to be the funding for the capability, the tools that you're looking for DFAT to embed to focus on conflict prevention. I think conflict prevention itself cannot remain an unfunded expectation that's placed upon an already, I suppose, stretched aid program. I think the second thing that we wanted to acknowledge is there's a wide range of partners involved in delivering the aid program for DFAT. There are NGOs, there are civil society organisations. I know you've spoken to a lot of these already. Multilats, local organisations in country, the private sector, and of course the contracting community that we're representing here today. I think it's a real strength of the Australian aid program that you do have all of these different partners. They all have different capabilities, but we do work together around that same objective, in particular when we're looking at conflict prevention. I think one of the things we focused on as well was that One Australia approach, and I no doubt we'll have questions on that today. What we mean by that is Australia working together. It's, you know, all of the arms of statecraft, whether it's the development arm that we work within, defence or diplomacy. I think there's the way that we look at it is there really needs to be a shared understanding of the risks that exist out there when we're talking about conflict prevention and how we engage with those risks as a group. So all of those three arms of statecraft, I think it's really important to address those risks that we're looking to collectively resolve, I suppose. The fourth thing that I did want to mention just briefly is that I think good policy really only becomes conflict prevention if it's built into the programs that DFAT has. And, you know, it's built into the programs in the way that they're designed, the way that they're tendered, the way that they're managed, and the way that they're adapted as well over time, I think is really important. So we think that the procurement, the program settings should really reward what we have called adaptive management. So that's looking at providing perhaps sometimes for longer term timeframes when they're needed. It's also looking at specific provisions for course correction over time, in particular when we're looking at programs that have that level of conflict prevention as part of their programming. So they're the sort of four things I wanted to flag early on. I think just to summarise, I think Australia really needs to have a strong aid program. We need a clearer conflict prevention approach, and we need really a practical way that, and I think we do have that, and practical settings that allow all of the different implementing partners to work together in, I guess I'd term it, the right way. So that's our opening from IDCC. Hopefully it wasn't too long for you.
Thank you. Tetra Tech?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. I'm Emma Lewis from Tetra Tech. We are a development firm with more than 60 years' experience across the Indo-Pacific, delivering program management, research, evaluation and advisory services. We are a member of the IDCC and currently manage more than 20 Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade programs across 26 countries. As a key implementing partner for DFAT, our experience across the region shows that Australia's International Development Program is one of the most effective tools available to prevent conflict. Development addresses the root causes of instability over time, strengthening institutions, supporting inclusion and building resilience in ways that diplomacy and security measures alone cannot. Conflict is often driven by poverty, exclusion, weak governance, resource scarcity and climate and disaster shocks. Development investments that improve sustainable infrastructure, disaster and climate resilience, education and livelihoods can reduce these pressures before they escalate to violence. Our submission highlighted 4 key recommendations. Sustain ODA investments, recognising Australia's strength in conflict prevention and peace building through the International Development Portfolio. Elevate regional partnerships, continue to invest in locally led approaches and regional interoperability, mainstream conflict sensitivity, making conflict prevention more explicit in programs, and enable novel ODA approaches, adjust procurement and contract models to enable flexible delivery. In closing, Australia's development program should remain a central instrument of conflict prevention because it addresses the causes of instability before they become crises, and it does so in ways that are locally grounded, gender responsive, and align with Australia's long-term interests. Thank you.
Thank you. DT Global.
Thank you, Chair. Byron Pakula from DT Global. I want to build on what Nathan and Emma have talked about and build on this opportunity to appear today, and thank you for that. DT Global submission makes a simple but important argument. Australia's international development program is not peripheral to conflict prevention. It is a critical pillar of regional stability. Development complements defence and diplomacy to prevent conflict, strengthen resilience, and build trusted relationships across the Indo-Pacific. Central to Australia's development program is our national interest, including the pursuit of regional stability and security. Our region faces rising geopolitical competition, democratic backsliding, climate-fueled instability, and disruptions from AI. For Australia to remain a trusted partner of choice in the Indo-Pacific, development assistance must not be treated as a not as a nice to have, but as a strategic pillar of Australia's conflict prevention architecture. Committee, through delivering programs on behalf of DFAT, DT Global sees firsthand how development investments reduce fragility and strengthen social cohesion. In Papua New Guinea, the Building Community Engagement Program is supporting local leaders to resolve grievances before they escalate into conflict. In Timor-Leste, the Participant Program is strengthening village development and municipal administration systems, deepening trust between citizens and state. In Indonesia, the Partnership for Justice Program is supporting legal reforms and strengthening the justice system in partnership with institutions such as the Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia. And there are many more examples of this. These are not abstract development outcomes, they are stability outcomes achieved through the development program. Our submission also emphasises that conflict prevention is not only about what Australia does, but how Australia does it. Development is most effective when it is working with local leaders, institutions, communities and organisations that understand the local drivers of fragility and pathways to peace. And it must also be deliberately inclusive so that women, people with disability, young people and marginalised groups are treated as essential partners in building resilience. So our core message to the committee is this. The development is a central instrument of Australia's statecraft. Used well, it prevents conflict before it escalates, strengthens the resilience of our neighbours, and keeps Australia as a trusted partner in an increasingly contested Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you all. Can I start with a big picture question that goes to, I think, an issue that all three of your submissions converge on, and that's the need for a more explicit and coherent whole of government approach to conflict prevention. For example, IDCC's overarching recommendation calls for a One Australia approach that aligns development program with diplomatic and security engagement through, quote, shared analysis, joint objectives where appropriate, and clear coordination arrangements. DT Global similarly argues that development should be, quote, explicitly tasked and resourced as a strategic pillar alongside defence and diplomacy. Can I ask at the big picture question, from your experience delivering programs on the ground, how effectively does coordination between lines of effort in the Australian government, between DFAT, Defence, AFP, other Australian government agencies, actually function in practice in your experience in the programs that you're delivering on the ground?
Erin Anderson from Cowater International. Variable, I guess, is the answer. I think DFAT and the AFP and Defence do an excellent job in some extremely trying circumstances. But having led the transition from Ramsey to the drawdown and a civilian authority, which I led at that point, which was a managing contractor delivered platform, that experience is an example where I think there was excellent integration because there was a mandated authority that was resourced to support that coordination. And so that, I would say, is probably a flagship example of how Australia can do that, particularly when it transitions from a defence-led stance to a civilian-led authority. Where I have seen it be less effective from my experiences is, again, where that mechanism hasn't been effectively resourced and given a clear governance mandate to integrate the Australian agencies and entities and their interests. So I think it's very much about ensuring that when it has gone well, it's resourced. And that it's, government agencies work together when they are given a clear governance structure and mandate to work within.
If I may, Chair, we would echo the sentiments from Erin, and in our experience, perhaps pass to Heidi to reflect on some of the humanitarian work that we're delivering and reflections on that.
Thanks, Chair. Heidi Winder from Tetra Tech. We manage 3 humanitarian programs on behalf of the DFAT, the Humanitarian Logistics Capability, which has a warehouse in Brisbane that can service 11,000 families with humanitarian relief supplies. We also manage the Pacific Humanitarian Warehousing Program Infrastructure Specialist Unit that's supporting the Pacific community to build 14 warehouses throughout the Pacific and in Timor-Leste to pre-position humanitarian relief supplies before disasters strike. And we also manage the Australia Assist program, which is Australia's largest civilian deployment capability, which has a roster of humanitarian professionals that we send to Australia's partners globally, whether that be multinational organisations or to Pacific Island governments, to build preparedness. I think there has been some really good initial wins in this area of working across government, whole of government, in the area of humanitarian response, particularly in working with defence. So as part of that humanitarian logistics capability, we work in lockstep with defence, particularly like just recently we responded to Tropical Cyclone Mila and sent humanitarian relief supplies to Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea on defence assets out of Amberley. But I think, echoing everyone else's opinions here, that there is more we can do in that area. I think we at Tetra Tech see that we would value a more joined up approach working across government, where we have shared objectives, and if we could have programs that straddle across departments that are really looking at working more collaboratively, I think that would really be a recipe for conflict prevention, for us to step up more from being output oriented to outcome oriented in that area. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to add to that, or?
So I'll add on to that if that's okay, but I'll be brief about it because I think my colleagues have, from the development sector have been pretty good in covering it. I was talking with one of my other colleagues last night actually on this topic, and he's the country manager for Papua New Guinea. And we were talking about the Enga province where there's tribal conflict. And I actually think about the quality of coordination is not just in terms of the Australian High Commissions and embassies for conflict prevention, but broader across the development sector as well. In that situation, DFAT really holds the role and responsibility of coordinating all the different agencies and programs across the Australian High Commission. And so in Enga province, there's tribal conflict, and the program that we're managing on behalf of the development side of things, the Australian Partnership for Law and Justice, was asked to support the judicial system in that space. Whereas we're working as well, or DFAT has also got operating there, the Australian Federal Police working policing. And so you see both of these arms working quite collaboratively at a subnational level when it's driven by the High Commission. And that's where we see good examples that we think can be built upon.
Thank you. I'll give the call to Ms. Jarrett.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take a slightly different tack. I noticed, I think it was Tetra Tech's submission that talked about novel ODA delivery and then said including in the private sector. And I absolutely agree that the private sector is a completely untapped area, whether that be through formal arrangements, through public-private partnerships, or just even tapping into the social engagement that a lot of big companies in the region have. Can you comment on that? And is that something we should be looking to as a way to, as another channel for conflict prevention? I'll open it up to the floor.
We can start in the next. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. There are a couple of threads which we will share across the representatives today. in terms of our submission, we had a number of intentions behind that. At one level, strengthening and enabling regional partnerships and locally led development and the types of scaffolding and support which is required around that. For example, across our portfolio, 60% of our service providers are local organisations, or in true number terms, that's 669. And so in being able to work effectively, there is support which is required around financial literacy, safeguarding policy and compliance to the contractual terms that we sign up to. And so it's being able to provide support and meeting partners where they're at, which is a point in time and a continuum which will change, and so we refer to that as scaffolding. There are some other examples, I guess, which would then enable, through that support, more flexible delivery arms. And similarly for the private sector, looking at different contracting forms, which are, and I think Sophia will be able to speak to this shortly, some of the risk thresholds and appetites and different ways of engaging that can draw on not only the representation in country of private sectors, but having greater participation for a diverser range of suppliers also. And perhaps I'll pass.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophia Fernandez. I mean, one of the ways that we've been discussing is looking at other donor environments, which we all work to globally, where there are much more flexible, rapid funding mechanisms to really respond to crises that translates analysis into action fairly quickly, and means that you can operate in a matter of weeks and months rather than years to respond. And that means that you need to have fundamentally political economy and conflict analysis at the core that speaks to all your arms, you know, that sort of whole of government, whole of Australia approach, rather than having siloed streams. But also a different risk appetite, as Emma was just speaking about, for intervention or engagement rather, and partnerships within DFAT and within all the arms of government. That means that you can learn and adapt and test, but at times actually also fail, because the ultimate issue here is rapid response and then learning, adapting and adjusting as you go. And that takes a different mechanism than the current sort of procurement systems that tend to fund large facilities that run for quite a significant period of time, or within those facilities, you know, the appetite to kind of respond very quickly to what you might see contextually. And we've seen this happen really successfully in other countries in other donor environments where there are certain mechanisms set up specifically for this type of mobilisation.
On notice, do you think you could share with us some of those examples?
Yeah, sure.
That would be terrific. But I also do want to get back to, so there are large multinational companies in a lot of the markets that we have concerns about, and a lot of them have social engagement programs. And you mentioned financial literacy. One I used to work for does financial literacy. I'm not sure they do it in those markets or not. But my point is there a way that we should be formally tapping into what they're doing as well, because they obviously have a vested interest in security and peace and resilience and economic growth and preventing conflict, etc. Are we missing something there?
I can probably speak to that from, again, another donor context. Cowater International is a Canadian company, and Canada's international development program integrates a lot more with some of its CSR priorities for Canadian companies that operate around the world, particularly in the resource sector. So an example of where Canada does that is in some very fragile and conflict-affected states, not in our region, but in other regions, where those companies integrate into a broader Canadian-led response and focus on their part of it. So they, particularly obviously being resource sector companies, their expertise is in that area, and in working with landowners and local owners in those resource projects. So they're very comfortable to participate in that way, but we see it work best when it's led by a whole of government response, and then the companies are participating in the area where they most bring, expertise and support, usually combined with, development assistance from people like Codewater International, backed by, GAC, which is the Canadian equivalent of DFAT. But it's usually a joined up response, and they're more comfortable operating often in that space where their mandate is clear.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr Zapier.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, folks, for appearing before the committee. My question sort of follows on from Madonna's last question. How do we ensure that Australian aid programs don't duplicate the work that other countries are also funding? And are efforts made to coordinate the programs using funding from a range of different countries?
Sophia Fernandez, yes. I mean, I think that there is, we've seen our previous submissions and interactions here at the committee that really pressed for a conflict prevention framework. And I think that is the underlying architecture that's needed to allow for that coordination to happen across programs within a singular context. Certainly management contractors have a role to play, and we have played that role by coordinating joint technical working groups or coordinating, across development partners, whether they may be NGOs, multilaterals, or local NGOs, even government ministries, etc., to ensure that there's clear division of labour and clear areas to avoid duplication. So that happens, I think, sometimes quite organically, but also in this context, DFAT does need to play a role, and their direction, and if there is a clear sort of framework that sits behind all of that, allows then us as implementing partners to then have a clear way to engage in the wider ecosystem in the countries that we work in. But we've seen across the board, I think, really successful examples of that in many of the countries that we work in, where we would facilitate that type of engagement as a matter of course.
Just to jump in on that, thanks, Sophia. Yeah, I mean, that's the core role of DFAT often in country, and as managing contractors and certainly as everybody in the development ecosystem who's working with the Australian Aid Program. That's one of the key things that the DFAT officers at Post do, is donor coordination across the different portfolios. I think the important thing is that them, having the personnel to do it at Post, the expertise and capability, they do an excellent job of it, but it is a large amount of work that is often quite invisible. And them having the frameworks, as Sophia said, that back up that coordination response. So they do rely on, a clear governance framework for whatever the donor coordination issue is. I see it at the moment, they do it extremely effectively, for example, on gender equality. Australia really leads on donor coordination on gender equality. It would be great for, a more joined up approach in areas like conflict prevention.
Tim, can I follow up with just one other question on that? To reverse the question, is there ever what I would refer to as competition from different countries trying to provide aid to a particular country in order to win favour from that country? In other words, we're going to help you do this and we're going to do it better than that country in order for you to perhaps do a trade deal or whatever with us.
Sophia Fernandez. I think similarly to the Australian Aid Program, development has been tied to national interests for quite some time. So without commenting too explicitly on other countries, I do think that that's been a common thread to the development or ODA funding across many different donors. Part of the diplomatic work that DFAT does and does so well is navigate some of those dynamics, probably more so than what would be the role of management contractors in this space. We would perhaps facilitate some engagement, and particularly the information that may be coming from very localised scenarios and understanding things like local drivers, perhaps some sort of early warning responses in the work that we do, and certainly can inform some of that positioning, but I think really sits well within the remit of DFAT.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim.
Sorry, I can see that our virtual witness has their hand up as well.
Thank you. And I will just add on to what's been said, because I think this is a really important discussion, particularly when we talk about defence, diplomacy and development working together as statecraft. And we do see good opportunities and examples where we are harmonising our development program with other like-minded countries. In Papua New Guinea, the Economic and Social Infrastructure Project is co-financed by FCDO, the UK government. It's an example where the two are working together to deliver energy to remote areas. Across the Pacific, for example, the Farmer Plus program, which is agriculture development, is co-financed by New Zealand and Australia, working with the private sector. But we also do see contested situations. In Solomon Islands, for example, there are multiple donors working in the same sort of spaces, and there are some competition around particularly sort of infrastructure in the Solomon Islands infrastructure program, which is really effectively delivering infrastructure, but there is a competition for the hearts and minds of not just the people, but the government representatives with infrastructure as well. So you do see it on the ground, and as a managing contractor, our role is to support the Australian High Commission and the Australian Government to deliver and meet the expectations. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Ms Jarrett has a few questions she wants to follow up on.
Different area, but thank you, Chair. We heard earlier that climate resilience is a risk factor to conflict, and a lot of groups have mentioned that, and particularly in terms of creating food security or scarcity, people displacement, impact on women, domestic violence, therefore the impact on children, economic strength, etc. So if you look across your world, what's the picture like in the Indo-Pacific in that space? What are we doing? What are other actors doing? Are there examples of where we're seeing ODA done well? And do you see any gaps? I know that's a big question, but we're just trying to get a picture. If this is a really high risk area, how do we move forward?
I might kick off. Erin Anderson from Co-Water. I've recently actually completed an evaluation across Co-Water's global investments on gender and climate change, and looking at how we do it well and where we can do it better and the key lessons from it. From that, we learnt that the key thing is that if you want to be addressing these issues that are so closely tied to climate change, like conflict prevention, prevention of gender-based violence, and some of these extremely gendered issues that we see in the climate change narrative, you have to be doing it right from the beginning. So when you design a climate change intervention, you need to be designing it for gender equality. You need to be ensuring that women and children and young people are at the core of that process. We often find in climate work particularly, and I'm not sure why, I don't think it's ill-intentioned, but often we find that those groups are forgotten. It becomes quite a gender-neutral response, and that can happen sometimes. But we found from that work that, there were really three key things: that you have to do it right from the very beginning, very intentionally to be impactful. You have to use very good quality data and get very good quality data on the gendered impacts of climate change. And that you also need to be looking at finance, because finance is a key issue when it comes to climate change work. How most countries finance their climate change needs is actually one of the greatest political needs in the region right now. And finance is often quite not available to women and groups that actually need access to finance. So climate financing is a gender issue. It's extremely gendered, and climate financing instruments at the moment are quite gender blind, and they're missing the mark with the people who will be most impacted by climate change in our region, which is women and children and people with disability. We know that when there's a disaster, when there's significant climate change impacts, we know that women and children and people with disability are actually the first and most impacted groups, and we've got very good data on that.
Yeah, I guess, and that talks a little bit to another comment that I heard, and sorry, I don't mean to cut anyone off because I really am interested in hearing from you all, that it's a change in mind shift too of looking at the outcome not as women as a victim, but as women as actually a contributor to the solutions.
Yeah,
correct?
so like we've just recently worked with the Asian Development Bank on disaster resilience in Greater Vanuatu, sort of Port Vila city area. And as part of that project, women actually led the design for those disaster shelters. And what we found, because we can do a counterfactual because there's other disaster shelters that didn't take this approach, was that women brought things like thinking about safety for women and children in shelters and making sure that those shelters were safe spaces for women and children. They brought better accessibility, and they brought in, you know, the organisations of people with disabilities, and they made sure that those shelters would actually work for everyone in the community. They thought about things like childcare and the fact that when you are stuck in a disaster shelter for up to a week, who's going to look after all the kids? Because the mums can't look after the kids for 24 hours. So it was a really interesting counterfactual study in when women and people with disabilities lead the design of responses in this case in terms of the climate disaster response, you get a better outcome for everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll just add, Sophia Fernandez, that that DFAT, unlike other current donors at the moment, actually has a very strong JETSI policy and integration into its programs. And that actually is a bit of a shining light at the moment when we're looking at other donors pull back from ODA priorities in both climate and gender equality. And that means that, it can't be understated how much an outward policy position really does drive and incentivise not just the development work and planning, but also post, the diplomatic engagements, and likewise defence, and back to that whole of government approach across defence diplomacy and development.
Yeah, definitely. And if I add Emma Lewis, Tetra Tech, this is a great discussion, and it comes back to the investment in the root causes of conflict prevention. And so when we think about integrated planning, or integrated development planning and whole of government approaches, we see opportunity for intentional programming on climate, say in our education programs, and working with children across a diverse range of areas to understand what the impacts of climate will be, or have participation in the types of design responses that affect them as young people in the region in which we work. It's also a continuum, and it's great to hear that design initiative and involving and bringing visible a diverse range of voice to make spaces appropriate. Definitely in a moment I'll pass to Heidi for some of our humanitarian work. We would also see that need to be inclusive both for gender and more marginalised communities in the provision of infrastructure, which also speaks to some of the climate risks that we see across the region, and how we bring greater participation of a diverse range of representatives within the community in that kind of design response for infrastructure. And here we are talking about whether it's multi-use kind of shelters, which would also act as a school or a meeting hall of sorts, whether it's marketplaces and the like. And those provisions do lead to better outcomes and consideration for resilience in the long term. Do you want to speak to, Heidi, some of the humanitarian gender approaches?
Yeah. I think in over the last few years, Australia has really put an emphasis in humanitarian work in the preparedness stage, like at the front of that continuum. If you see that, the idea of a continuum of being the international development space, moving into disaster response, into recovery, and then back into stabilisation and back into development. It's kind of cyclical. So a lot of investment has been placed in preparedness. So in that Australia Assist program, we are pre-positioning humanitarian specialists in the region, working with Pacific Island governments to help prepare for disasters and to work with foreign governments to prepare in times of response. To give you an idea of some of the modest contributions that we're making in the Middle East, for instance, we have some humanitarians who are working to support with the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which we've signed up to as a country, and they're supporting other countries in the Middle East with their national action plans, not only to design them but to implement them as well. So assisting these countries to think more about the gender aspects than about purely participation, but also about ensuring that women get to influence in decisions and security, governance and resource allocations. Because as we've spoken about just now, the evidence shows that when you give women opportunities or agencies, that they tend to make good decisions for communities and families. So this is some of the contributions that modest contributions that we're doing in the Middle East through the humanitarian programs that we're implementing. Thank you.
I think DT Global.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic for us, and we could talk about this for a long time. And I know there's also a parliamentary inquiry into gender in the development program as well. But I just want to pull back a little bit and talk about the Climate Resilient Communities program is a way of for DFAT to integrate climate across the development program, and similarly you see something like a Pacific Women Lead integrating gender in inclusion across the parts of the program. And what I think DFAT does really well is when it sets a priority, and that priority comes through the strategies, into the development partnership plans, into the procurement processes, etc. Actually, I think the implementation is done to a very high standard. And we have examples of that in climate, and we have examples of that in gender. But to go back to the terms of reference for this parliamentary inquiry, less so on that climate sensitivity, conflict sensitivity side of things. And so that's part of the recommendations that we have put forward around integrating it into DFAT's way of working, if that is a priority for us. I think there are some overlaps with climate and nature-based conflict. For example, the scarce resources around food, water, energy, particularly in the Pacific, whereas, we operate in a very bifurcated world. So Asia has very different sort of issues, and there it's about integrating climate adaptation and mitigation into infrastructure, for example. So again, there's lots of good examples to draw upon, and be happy to share some if you'd like further.
Thank you.
Discussion.
I just wanted to, sorry, Nathan Hansford, IDCC, just to round that out a little bit. We talked a lot about climate, we talked a lot about gender as well. I think it's other conflict drivers as well. So we'll just pull one out of the air. Lack of trust in government organisations. There's a lot of work funded by DFAT on governance programs, public finance programs, institution building programs that are there in and of themselves, but they also have that restriction of conflict sort of focus as well. And I think, I can't remember if it was Erin or Emma that was talking before about how embedding that conflict prevention in the design, and then as Byron was saying, all the way through, whether that's in the development partnership plans, all the way through to contracting, I think is really important for all of the drivers of conflict as well. And there's lots of them, but I think as you flagged, gender and climate are really important ones, but there are a lot of others.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Can I ask a bit of a practical question around how sort of conflict sensitivity interacts with program delivery and practice? And I just want to put to you the evidence that the Development Intelligence Lab gave this morning in hearings. Their submission recommends implementation of a resilience monitoring system to track key indicators over time, and that would trigger earlier incremental adjustments to programming. It implies that analysis needs to be connected to decision making in a way that changes what's funded, when and where. I know that IDCC's submission also recommends investing in a, quote, standing capability that synthesises data and partner insights to support early identification and mitigation, and points to the UK's ACCEPT program and the FuseNet food security early warning model as international comparators that Australia could learn from. In this context, can I just ask, in the programs you manage or represent, when the monitoring systems that you use identify things like rising grievances, institutional stress on the ground, things that could lead to conflict over time, what actually happens next now in the current system? What's the response of Australia's ODA institutions to that when you're seeing it on the ground?
I might start, Sophia Fernandez, and then hand over to my colleagues who will have, I think, really concrete examples. But where I can speak to of where it's worked well in other donor settings, and certainly FuseNet and Acceptor are programs that Commonics have been running for some time, is when you have development programs really docking in with government defence and diplomacy priorities. A good example is actually in Afghanistan, where for a long time, Afghanistan stabilisation initiatives meant that development programming were working in areas such as, livelihoods, cash for work, looking at inclusion and gender equality issues, looking at reform with ministries on financial reform. And what that means is that in working very closely with local partners, with NGOs, with research think tanks, you're bringing that in that exposure and analysis very regularly into your overarching sort of conflict and political economy analysis that's informing back to post, in this case, US government post. And that's probably going back to what Development Intelligence were talking about, is that research and analysis capability being held centrally is critical to then inform across, not just DFAT, but across Australian government initiatives. While these programs, for example, in Afghanistan focus on building communities and trust with government, at the same time it's working alongside areas where military and diplomatic actors are also engaged in stabilisation. So you have a feed-in of information flow that's informing across the diplomatic strands. And in practice that meant development investments, reinforcing wider security objectives by strengthening local governments and governance and legitimacy in very fragile and conflict-affected areas. And certainly, I know Tetra Tech can speak to the humanitarian side of things, but that means that you're able to respond to shocks much more rapidly and flexibly, and inform that decision-making and response, not just on a development angle, but across into your defence and security sector portfolios as well. I'll hand over to my colleagues.
I can talk probably to a very specific example. Cowater delivers on behalf of DFAT Inclusive, which is the Australia-Indonesia Partnership Towards an Inclusive Society, and this is an 8-year program. It follows on from a 10-year investment that DFAT had in a similar area. This program works in 800 villages across Indonesia, working through local civil society partners who are very established in Indonesia, many of which we've had a 40-year relationship with. On the ground, how that works in reality is that those organisations monitor local levels of conflict and around a whole range of dimensions, but particularly looking at identifying the most marginalised groups in those villages who are often a lightning rod for conflict at the local level. And then what they do is through that human security lens, they work to ensure first that there's a preventative framework in place. So they work with local governments and village heads to ensure that local conflicts can be resolved at a local level and they don't escalate. The second part to that, though, is where they start to see a growing trend, they start to see conflict escalating, that rolls up through the partner network to national civil society partners who will work firstly with the Indonesian government, because in any time of conflict, the key thing is the sovereign role of the country in which we're operating and the role of that government in their own conflict prevention responses. And so that rolls up where a partner might be seeing very specific conflict around, say, natural resource developments in a particular region. They'll then bring that to the national level and say to us in the Cowater team, can you support us to have a dialogue with the Indonesian government around the conflict that we're seeing in this region? We'll support that dialogue and, generally there's a very good government response. At the same time, we'll communicate that there is that growing conflict and concern, you know, to the DFAT team that work very closely with that program. And so you've got this really good, I guess, connection between supporting the Indonesian government to respond to and address and be aware of its own local level conflict settings, at the same time as ensuring that DFAT's aware of those issues and how Indonesia's and its own partners are actually responding at the local level to those issues. And of course, it's very hard as a metric to measure, but over, you know, nearly 20 years of support, we have seen consistently that mechanisms like that basically support, you know, the prevention and diversion of conflict before it occurs at the local and provincial level in Indonesia.
Thanks for the question, Chair. Heidi Winder from Tetra Tech. So what are we doing currently in relation to this? So in the humanitarian space more broadly, there's a very comprehensive ecosystem that activates through the multilateral system, and the cluster system that gets stand up to activate when there is conflict. We have a very flexible contract model with the Australian government through DFAT to be able to pivot to respond to emerging needs through the Australia Assist program. We always reserve funding to be able to do that. And then so we will get requests through this international framework to support in times of crisis. And we will make sure we work in lockstep with the department to say these are the types of requests that we're seeing through the multilateral system. How does this align with the Australia's national interest? What type of roles would you like us to put forward from our humanitarian roster to respond for that? So if I can speak to one particular area, so since 2018, when the Rohingya fled from Myanmar across the border to Bangladesh in the camp, Australia has supported 72 humanitarian deployments into that camp over time with a focus on food distribution, but also a very strong focus on gender as well. We have some amazing humanitarians who go in there and really focus on accountability to affected populations and are working with agencies like UNHCR to come up with complaints and feedback mechanisms. From the reports that we've received from them, they're receiving about 1,000 calls a day to some of those accountability, conflict and feedback mechanisms. So the programs that Australia is supporting and sending humanitarians in to support in areas of crisis are really making sure that affected populations and refugees have an opportunity to be heard, and also that they're receiving timely information, understanding what the referral mechanisms are so that some of those tensions can be diffused there at the point before tensions arise or get worse. Thank you.
DP Global, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think this is a really important question, and there's different examples, but what I'd like to pull out is two capabilities that are really important for DFAT. One is what was being discussed around flexible adaptive management, being able to reallocate resources within existing contracts to be able to meet evolving needs. And the other one is having emergency response capabilities within the development program. So I'll touch on three really quick examples that are very different as to how monitoring systems can inform development delivery. First one is around like Bougainville. Bougainville is a post-conflict situation. It was a really, really messy civil war over a long period of time. And in that situation, to prevent conflict, it's a long-term focus around, establishing justice systems through the Law and Justice Program, as an example. So those are long-term thinking and long-term strategies. Solomon Islands is a really different example. There we see tensions between people in Malaita who see those on Guadalcanal having better services, better infrastructure, better education. So the program there that we're delivering for DFAT is the Education Sector Support Program, is building infrastructure, education infrastructure schools in Malaita. It is training teachers to try and reduce the tensions around uneven human capital and human development, the inequality that exists between those islands. And then if I look at a third example where it brings it in, the emergency response capability, biosecurity is an area. We experienced Papua New Guinea had African swine fever. It was very impactful on a lot of communities, a lot of families. But it also led to increasing sorcery accused related violence, SARV. There was gender-based violence, etc. And the whole of government response with Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, CSIRO, as well as DFAT through the Farmer Plus program, was around responding to that emergency, but also reducing the tensions in that community. So very different examples of how the monitoring systems operates, but essentially having flexible, adaptive ways of working and emergency response capabilities gives DFAT the levers to be able to then act on what they see.
Chair Sophia Fernandez, if I just may add one more point on that recommendation for capability. I think what's important to remember is that both in the case of ACCEPT, which is an Foreign Commonwealth Development Office funded research capability, and FuseNet, which is the Famine Early Warning System Network, which was funded by USAID, now US State, is that they're both global public goods. So it's those governments investing in a capability that not only their own governments can utilise, but other governments can utilise, as well as other actors as well. And that might speak to a piece that Development Intelligence Lab was speaking to this morning, that investments on top of current development ODA investment.
Okay. Thank you. That is almost ideally timed. Thank you for your evidence today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions or notice, please forward it to the Secretariat by Friday, 5 June 2026. Please note that responses to questions or notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. Members, if you would like to provide additional questions on notice for witnesses, please provide them to the Secretariat by close of business Monday, 11 May 2026. Witnesses, you'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering questions taken on notice today, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I would like to thank committee members and witnesses for their time today, and I now declare this public hearing closed.